Chapter 521. The essence of Avada Kedavra lies in severing the connection between the soul and the body. Even the young wizards, along with Professor Moody on the podium, furrowed their brows in confusion at what they heard. "Let me clarify," Professor Blaine said, raising his hands to gesture in front of him. "There exists a mysterious connection between the body and the soul, akin to a bridge. The fundamental function of Avada Kedavra is to cut off this bridge, severing the connection between the soul and the body. Once cursed, your soul loses its anchor and is forced to leave your body, crossing over to the other side, death. This is why it is said that those cursed cannot be cured." This vivid explanation helped the young wizards grasp the concept. Silence enveloped the classroom, and many wore expressions of discomfort. Professor Blaine attempted to convey that numerous spells could end a life, just as a brick or an arrow could. However, the notion of severing the soul's connection to the body was something they struggled to accept. Harry knew he shouldn't harbor unrealistic hopes, but after hearing Professor Blaine's explanation, he couldn't help but feel disappointed. Professor Blaine had made it clear that the death curse was fatal and irrefutable, with no possibility of healing because the connection between body and soul could not be re-established. Observing the somber young wizards, Professor Blaine, standing near Harry's table, cleared his throat and chuckled. "I've explained how this spell works. Now let's discuss some tips on dealing with Avada Kedavra." "But you just said Avada Kedavra is irresistible, Professor," Harry exclaimed, his green eyes wide with disbelief. "Not through orthodox methods, Mr. Potter, but rather through unconventional means," Professor Blaine replied with a smile. "Perhaps you've noticed Avada Kedavra's limitations. It cannot cause area damage. In other words, to kill 10 people with this spell, you must cast it 10 times. Its nature of targeting the connection between body and soul offers us some crafty ways to counter it. Using crafty methods to handle the most dangerous of the 3 unforgivable curses?" Harry was perplexed once more. "Do you still have those little creatures you used for the spell demonstration, Professor Moody?" Professor Blaine asked, turning to Professor Moody beside the podium. "I need them for a demonstration." "Here you go, Professor Blaine. Show us your brilliant idea." Professor Moody replied, opening a drawer and retrieving a glass bottle. This time, it contained numerous wriggling earthworms, having exhausted the spiders earlier. "Thank you. This is exactly what I need," Professor Blaine nodded, and a wand slipped from his sleeve. With a sudden clatter of desks and chairs, the young wizards around Professor Blaine hastily moved their benches, retreating from him. Only Harry remained, eagerly anticipating what would happen next. With a flick of his wand, Professor Blaine sent the cork of the glass bottle flying. The earthworms were magically lifted from the bottle, suspended mid-air, writhing feebly. "The next step is," Professor Blaine said, focusing on the brown earthworms. He pointed his wand at them, and after 2 peculiar chirps, the number of earthworms multiplied dramatically. In the blink of an eye, their numbers increased dozens of times. Lavender let out a short scream, and if Parvati hadn't steadied her, she might have fainted. Lavender had fallen off her stool, huddled in Parvati's arms, covering her eyes with both hands and trembling uncontrollably. Ron, relieved that Professor Moody hadn't handed him a spider, found Lavender's reaction amusing and couldn't help but smirk. The mass of writhing earthworms was indeed revolting, causing even Harry to lean back instinctively. "The essential!" Professor Blaine suddenly flicked his wrist, and the 6 or 7-inch earthworms separated, arranging themselves in mid-air to gradually form the shape of a garment. "Oh!" Hermione gasped, covering her mouth. She had grasped Professor Blaine's intention, and Professor Moody at the podium seemed to understand as well. "Aha! What a cunning method, Atticus!" he exclaimed. "What?" Harry quickly turned to Hermione, seeking an explanation. "Clothes," Hermione whispered, pointing at the earthworms. "Fill your clothes with earthworms." "It doesn't have to be earthworms, Miss Granger," Atticus chuckled. "As long as the creatures are relatively small and numerous enough, they can help block the Avada Kedavra curse." At that moment, everyone understood. It was a stroke of genius. Who would have thought there was a way to resist the unforgivable curse? According to Professor Blaine's theory, Avada Kedavra targets the connection between a creature's body and soul, causing indiscriminate damage. Therefore, by wearing a specially made protective suit and mask, Avada Kedavra could be rendered ineffective. After all, no matter how powerful the curse, it couldn't eliminate multiple living beings at once. The classroom buzzed with excitement as the young wizards discussed the idea. Even if they lacked a full understanding of the curse's former dominance, they were thrilled by Professor Blaine's imaginative solution. However, not everyone was convinced. "I'd rather die under the unforgivable curse than have hundreds of earthworms on me. It's so disgusting!" Lavender exclaimed in horror, struggling to breathe at the thought of the earthworms. "I must remind you," Professor Blaine interjected, cooling their excitement. "This method is merely a trick. It can help you avoid sneak attacks or fatal mistakes in direct confrontations, but it won't be effective for long. Your opponent isn't a fool. They'll quickly figure out your strategy and with a few simple spells, dismantle your defense. So don't rely solely on cleverness to win a life-and-death duel. You must work diligently, learn, hone your skills, and always remain vigilant." Professor Blaine glanced at the clock on the wall. "We have 5 minutes left before class ends. Let's summarize. Since the Imperious Curse, Cruciatus Curse, and Avada Kedavra Curse are considered unforgivable, I encourage you not to fear them excessively. Among the many spells, there are countless that can kill or cause fates worse than death. So why does the Ministry of Magic prohibit these 3 spells and label them unforgivable? Wishing everyone a happy Mid-Autumn Festival and National Day." End of this chapter. Chapter 522, a major event. As the class was nearing its end, Professor Blaine refrained from his usual theatrics. Instead, after posing a question, he promptly provided the answer himself, not waiting for any student to respond. "There are several reasons," he began. "Firstly, the effects of these 3 spells are of paramount importance. Secondly, as I've mentioned before, the threshold for using these spells isn't as high as you might think. In fact, once you grasp the technique, an Owl's-level wizard can essentially wield them." This revelation was far from comforting. Many young wizards shifted uneasily in their seats, casting nervous glances at their peers, as if expecting someone to suddenly leap up and cast an unforgivable curse. "And the most crucial factor," Professor Blaine continued, "is that the 3 unforgivable curses share a commonality. This trait is also present in many spells classified as dark magic. It's akin to the Patronus charm used against Dementors. Can anyone tell me the secret to the Patronus charm?" The Patronus charm, once considered obscure and complex, had gained popularity since Atticus Blaine's dramatic display during the previous year's Quidditch match between Gryffindor and Hufflepuff. Now, most young wizards were familiar with it. "It's a happy memory," Harry volunteered, raising his hand and seizing the opportunity to answer. "The strength of the Patronus charm depends on the happy memory you focus on when casting it. The deeper the happiness, the more powerful the Patronus." Draco Malfoy sneered, unimpressed. "The power of emotion is a key component in many advanced spells," Professor Blaine acknowledged, nodding approvingly at Harry. He awarded him 5 points and gestured for him to sit. "With the 3 unforgivable curses, the malevolent thoughts in your mind are crucial. To amplify the spell's power, your evil intentions must be stronger. Do you understand? Wizards often seek the ultimate power in spells, and these particular spells will lure you into becoming increasingly ruthless until your mind is consumed by cruelty. They will drag you into the abyss." Professor Blaine's calm demeanor was tinged with a chilling undertone. Many dark magics operate this way, using immense power to tempt the user into darkness. Unless you possess a strong will and mental fortitude to resist, it's unwise to be overly curious about these types of magic. "Oh, Professor Blaine forgot to mention something," Hermione exclaimed as the bell rang. True to his reputation for punctuality, Professor Blaine promptly left the classroom. Professor Moody, however, assigned a hefty load of homework. Hermione frowned, staring at the door. He mentioned an ancient technique that can effectively counteract spiritual magic attacks, like the Imperious Curse, but he didn't elaborate. "I need to visit the library." "You'll need a note first," Ron interjected, approaching with his school bag. "If you're looking for magic to resist the Imperious Curse, it'll probably be in the restricted section. By the way, what happened this morning? Harry told me you think Professor Moody punished Malfoy unfairly?" Harry, who had been contemplating asking Hagrid about magical creatures that were neither worm-like nor spider-like, was jolted from his thoughts by Ron's question. He coughed awkwardly, looking flustered. Hermione shot Harry a sideways glance and let out a small huff. "Mr. Longbottom." Hermione was about to grab her school bag and leave when Professor Moody's voice suddenly halted Neville, who was heading for the door. "I think you have nothing else." If something significant was happening elsewhere in the castle. The absence of so many professors was unusual and unsettling. Atticus Blaine, the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor, had quickly become a topic of intrigue among the students. His teaching methods were unconventional, yet undeniably effective. Harry couldn't help but feel a mix of curiosity and apprehension about what might be unfolding behind the scenes. As Harry pondered these HTS, Ron nudged him, breaking his reverie. "Do you think it has something to do with the Triwizard Tournament?" Ron speculated, his voice low to avoid drawing attention. Harry shrugged, glancing around the Great Hall. "Could be, but whatever it is, it must be important to pull so many professors away." Hermione returned to the table, her arithmancy books clutched tightly in her arms. She noticed the empty seats at the staff table and raised an eyebrow. "What's going on?" she asked, sliding into her seat. "We were just wondering the same thing," Harry replied. "It's odd, isn't it?" Hermione nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I suppose we'll find out soon enough, but for now, let's focus on what we can control." The trio turned their attention back to their lunch, though the mystery of the missing professors lingered in their minds. As they ate, the chatter of the Great Hall continued around them, filled with the usual mix of laughter and gossip. Despite the distractions, Harry couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was on the horizon. He resolved to keep a close eye on any developments, knowing that at Hogwarts, surprises were never far away. Something unexpected had occurred at the school. Atticus Blaine immediately turned to Neville and asked nervously, "So many professors are absent. Have you heard any news?" Neville shook his head innocently, replying, "They weren't here when I arrived." Meanwhile, on the third floor of the castle, Atticus Blaine, who was calmly adjusting the surveillance camera in his office, suddenly frowned. He abandoned his task, leapt out from a pile of parts, and swiftly made his way to the door. He opened it just before anyone could knock. "Everyone?" he exclaimed, seeing the professors, including Principal Dumbledore, gathered at his doorstep. Atticus asked seriously, "What major event has happened?" End of this chapter. Chapter 523, Inspiration. The person standing at the door of his office was none other than Principal Dumbledore, flanked by Professor Flitwick, Professor McGonagall, and other faculty members. They had all gathered at his office door, a sight Atticus Blaine had never witnessed before. "What's going on? Has something major happened?" Atticus wondered, his mind racing with possibilities, none of which seemed significant enough to warrant such a gathering of professors at his doorstep. "Don't be nervous, Atticus," Dumbledore said with a reassuring smile, his silver beard flowing gently. "Filius, Minerva, and the rest of us are here to— Oh, why don't we go inside and talk?" Atticus noticed the urgency in Professor McGonagall's and Professor Flitwick's eyes and raised an eyebrow. "All right, it's dinner time. We can have a private dinner," he suggested, welcoming his colleagues into the office. With a wave of his wand, Atticus cleared the floor of panoramic telescopes and parts, which flew into a magically expanded storage box. His office, however, lacked enough seating for everyone. Just as he was about to conjure more chairs, Dumbledore, having taken an interest in the alchemy tools, smiled and said, "Don't trouble yourself, Atticus. We can manage." Each professor then used their wand to summon chairs from the void, each tailored to their preference. The coffee table in front of the sofa moved with a playful hop to accommodate the professors. After Atticus prepared tea for everyone, he opened the curtains and windows with a flick of his wand, inviting in fresh air and warm sunlight. "So," Atticus began, perching himself on the armrest of the sofa, "what's this all about?" "We heard from the students, Atticus," Professor Flitwick exclaimed excitedly, standing on a bench to speak. "You've invented a new method to help young wizards learn spells, haven't you? Miss Patil mentioned in Charms class that she mastered the stunning and disarming charms in just 3 hours using your technique. It's remarkable. She said your method identifies exactly where her difficulties lie. It must be effective for transfiguration as well, right, Atticus? Professor McGonagall added with keen interest. Transfiguration is a complex branch of magic. If your method aids in learning spells, it could be beneficial for transfiguration too. Could you share your innovative ideas with us, Atticus? Oh, so that's what this is about? Atticus finally understood, exhaling in relief. I thought the Ministry of Magic was planning to shut down Hogwarts. You know, Atticus, our resources are limited, Professor McGonagall said earnestly. We can't provide every student with personalized guidance on all spells. Take Mr. Longbottom, for instance. He requires extensive practice and instruction to keep up. I heard your method can teach multiple students simultaneously. Perhaps we could adopt it. The other professors echoed similar sentiments. Atticus listened attentively to their concerns and then turned to Dumbledore. Is this your reason for coming as well, Headmaster Dumbledore? I'm certainly interested, Atticus, Dumbledore replied with a chuckle. If your method can significantly enhance the teaching efficiency of certain courses, I have every reason to be attentive. Of course, we must first ensure its safety. Atticus smirked inwardly. It was well known that Dumbledore rarely involved himself in the day-to-day teaching operations at Hogwarts. His sudden interest in Atticus's small innovation seemed like an opportunity to glimpse into his spiritual world. All right, I think I understand, Atticus said, nodding. After listening to the professor's appeals, Atticus Blaine showed no surprise. Instead, he frowned slightly and said, However, there are some problems. What is it, Atticus? Professor Flitwick asked nervously. Atticus pondered for a few seconds before speaking. Whether it's spells, transformations, or other types of magic, you can indeed use my methods to accelerate the learning process for young wizards and deepen their understanding of magic. You all heard what I told the students. I incorporate them into my spiritual world and let them practice the standard configurations of magic spells. Each young wizard receives corresponding guidance, but you must understand that this guidance comes from me. These magic configurations are infused with my experience and thoughts, and it's my spiritual strength that sustains this teaching method. However, Atticus continued slowly, while thoughts and experiences can be extracted using magic, it's impossible to provide unlimited guidance to multiple young wizards simultaneously. The burden is too great. Atticus's meaning was clear. They lacked the power to maintain this kind of spiritual magic. The disappointment on Professor Flitwick's face was evident. He knew how thrilled Atticus had been after coming up with such a fantastic idea. Not every young wizard has the quick understanding of Percy Weasley or Hermione Granger, who can grasp concepts after a single lesson. Most young wizards lack a systematic understanding of magic. They often feel confused and must practice repeatedly to master a new spell. Moreover, by the time of the final exam, they may have forgotten all the knowledge they had mastered. Like Neville Longbottom, and of course, Vincent Crabbe and Gregory Goyle in Slytherin, whose fathers were not the brightest during their time at Hogwarts. Can you let me experience it too, Atticus? Your method? Professor Flitwick asked eagerly. If it's convenient, Atticus, I'd also like to see it firsthand, Professor McGonagall added, making the same request. The other professors quickly followed suit, hoping to experience it themselves. Even if they couldn't implement it widely, they could still brainstorm ideas, right? Ahem, if you don't mind, Atticus. Principal Dumbledore interjected, raising an eyebrow as he listened to the professor's discussion. Don't be ridiculous, Principal Dumbledore, Atticus replied with a dark expression. I don't have the mental strength to accommodate you. 10 minutes later, the atmosphere in the office became lively. The faculty and staff, having just returned from Atticus's spiritual world, were eagerly discussing their experiences with surprised expressions. An excellent method, Atticus. Simply wonderful. Professor Flitwick exclaimed, nearly falling off his chair in excitement. Accurate and objective evaluations can provide corrections and guidance to the young wizards. If we could incorporate this method into the classroom and allow them to train with it after regular teaching, I bet the quality of education at Hogwarts would improve significantly. The Wizarding Examination Authority would be astonished by Hogwarts' teaching level, and the wizarding world would benefit greatly. For transfiguration, the evaluation provided by this method isn't comprehensive enough, Professor McGonagall noted objectively. But as Phileas said, if we can promote it, we can better pass on our experience, and many will benefit. Atticus shrugged. But here's the crux of the problem. First, magic configurations are invisible in the real world. Furthermore, those experiences and evaluations all originate from me. Without my thoughts attached to those configurations, they are ineffective. Accommodating many young wizards with spiritual power consumes a tremendous amount of energy, and the cost is too high. That's not necessarily true, Atticus. The teacup in front of Dumbledore was full, yet he hadn't touched the bitter brew. Although he hadn't witnessed the events firsthand, he listened intently to the discussions around him, piecing together how Atticus Blaine had accomplished everything. The difficulties you mentioned are not without solutions, Dumbledore said, his blue eyes gleaming with wisdom. He looked at Atticus, whose eyelids were slightly drooped, and gestured toward the box where Atticus had just stored the surveillance camera. Moreover, the solution is quite apparent. We can address those challenges through the field of alchemy. End of this chapter. Chapter 524. Original capital today was a regular school day, and Professor McGonagall, along with the others, couldn't dedicate all their time to promoting the efficient learning spell method developed by Atticus Blaine. In the office, only those without pressing matters remained: Atticus, Star, and Dumbledore. They sat on the sofa, discussing the parchment spread out on the table before them. The basic idea, Atticus began, biting his quill thoughtfully, is to design a brand new alchemical device with a constant magic that can extract a young wizard's spirit and place it into a virtual spiritual space. For this, we can partially reference the mechanism of the soul-stealing curse. Of course, the core of the machine requires a magical corridor capable of accommodating the memories or thoughts of the professors. Only then can it serve as a guide. We can draw inspiration from the pensieve, Dumbledore suggested, glancing at Atticus. However, this kind of alchemical tool will consume a vast amount of magic. There must be an efficient method to absorb and store magic to power this machine. Atticus nodded, adding more structures to the densely packed magical nodes on the parchment, which shimmered like stars. After completing this task, he sighed with relief, then frowned. It's incredibly challenging. We must consider so many aspects. The final magic pattern array will be quite complex, and all these structures must be compatible. This isn't something that can be completed in a day or two, but it is possible. I need to visit the library to gather some information. There was no doubt about the capabilities of Atticus and Dumbledore. Their passion and dedication to magic were undeniable. Before they realized it, the sun had set behind the mountains, and cheers echoed from the field outside. Laughter filled the air as young wizards enjoyed themselves after a day of classes. I can spare some time to help design part of the texture, Dumbledore offered, waving his wand to conjure a delicious drink. In Atticus's office, he would never serve anything other than green tea. Care to join me for dinner in the Great Hall, Atticus? Dumbledore invited warmly. This isn't something that can be rushed. I plan to visit the library first to find some books, Atticus replied, still deeply engrossed in the afternoon's results. It was a fascinating and meaningful topic. Dumbledore could only shake his head helplessly. As he prepared to leave with his honey water, Atticus suddenly stopped him. "Wait, Headmaster," Atticus called out, raising his head. Dumbledore turned, curiosity in his gaze. Atticus pondered for a few seconds before speaking slowly. "I just remembered something. Do you recall our conversation the night before school started?" Dumbledore looked slightly surprised, not expecting Atticus to bring up that discussion, but his expression quickly returned to normal. "If you mean the idea of having Hogwarts secede from the school board, of course, I remember. Do you have any new thoughts, Atticus?" "Yes," Atticus nodded. He looked at Dumbledore, who was seated on the sofa, and spoke softly. "We plan to have the school board voluntarily cut off financial support for Hogwarts. Then, through the Ministry of Magic, we can ban those who follow Voldemort's family's industries. By doing so, we can transform those industries into school assets. However, this transition may take time, and Hogwarts will need to reserve some funds." The light in Dumbledore's blue eyes flickered with interest. Atticus Blaine knew that the sudden mention of this matter was not without reason. He settled back into the sofa and asked calmly, "What do you think, Atticus?" "Initially, I considered asking the Malfoy family to contribute a portion of their wealth. I have quite a few levers over them, and I believe they would cooperate," Atticus replied, observing Dumbledore's furrowed brow with a smile. "But now, I have a new idea." He tapped the parchment on the table. "Oh!" Dumbledore's eyes widened slightly, a hint of surprise in his voice. "Do you think this kind of alchemical device could help the school save some funds?" "Absolutely. Once this alchemical tool is released, it will undoubtedly capture the world's attention," Atticus said with a grin. "Hogwarts is recognized as one of the top 7 wizarding schools globally. Whether it's you, me, Professor McGonagall, or Professor Flitwick, we've all achieved significant academic success. I bet that with some simple publicity, individuals, families, or organizations eager to purchase this highly practical alchemical tool will flock to us." As Dumbledore pondered deeply, Atticus continued, "Let's call it a learning machine. We don't need to sell it at a high price. Instead, we can generate a steady stream of income for Hogwarts in another way. For instance, we can program the machine with standards, the experience of all spells from levels 1 to 4. Then, we can sign a contract with the purchasers. The more they pay, the greater access they gain to learn more spells. Of course, this access would be time-limited, requiring renewal." Ignoring Dumbledore's twitching mouth, Atticus spoke with enthusiasm. "Not only standard spells, but also transfiguration and special spells like the Patronus charm. We can embed the experience of these spells into the machine. If someone wants to learn these special spells, part of the galleons received as extra payment would go to the professor who contributed their expertise. The rest would be managed by Remus, who would start a company to handle the funds. We wouldn't need to reveal the company's connection to Hogwarts until we sever ties with the school board." When Dumbledore left, his expression was somewhat somber. No matter how innovative his ideas were, they always seemed a step behind Atticus, who had the advantage of insights from both the Muggle and Wizarding worlds. Moreover, the Muggle society Atticus came from was more progressive than contemporary British society. Dumbledore had only one request, that Hogwarts students should not have to pay extra to enjoy this convenience. Naturally, Atticus had no intention of profiting from the students. "By the way, Headmaster," Atticus called out as they parted ways at the third-floor corridor's corner platform. Dumbledore was heading to the Great Hall for dinner, having even skipped lunch to discuss this matter, while Atticus was off to the library for research. "Neville Longbottom is Harry's classmate. You must know something about him. I vaguely recall the Longbottom family." "Mr. Longbottom's parents suffered greatly during the last war." Dumbledore paused, his voice heavy. "They are still receiving treatment at St. Mungo's Hospital for magical injuries and maladies." "Was it the Cruciatus Curse?" Atticus narrowed his eyes. "Before the war ended, some Death Eaters captured Mr. Longbottom's parents and tortured them mercilessly to discover Tom's whereabouts," Dumbledore explained, echoing the grim tales he had shared with the young wizards. "In Alastor's class, they experienced the most powerful Cruciatus Curse." Dumbledore was well aware of Atticus Blaine's words in Moody's Defense Against the Dark Arts class. He sighed deeply, and his bright blue eyes dimmed with concern. "According to your theory, the spiritual worlds of Atticus, Frank, and Alice have been shattered. Their spirits have become abnormal, and they require constant care to survive," Dumbledore said, his voice heavy with empathy. "That's correct," Atticus replied, narrowing his eyes slightly as if lost in thought. "Atticus," Dumbledore addressed him cautiously, "I have also attempted to heal Frank and Alice, but the damage inflicted by that magic is beyond my abilities. I must admit, I am powerless in this regard. As you can see, this situation has dealt a significant blow to Mr. Longbottom. Therefore, unless you are completely certain, I hope you won't give that child false hope." End of this chapter. Chapter 525. Atticus Blaine was teased. After finishing her afternoon elective course, Hermione hurried to the playground to prepare for her daily physical education training. Harry and Neville had already completed their training and were sweating profusely as they prepared to return to the dormitory bathroom to clean up. Next, they planned to tackle the homework assigned by Professor Blaine for Wednesday night in the common room. Once Hermione finished her training, she jogged back to the Great Hall. After taking a few quick bites of food, she intended to head to the library to research the ancient magical weapon skills that Professor Blaine had mentioned in today's Defense Against the Dark Arts class. This was the most relaxed and cheerful time of the day in the castle. Groups of young wizards moved up and down the stairs, their faces lit with cheerful smiles. These smiles made Hermione feel a twinge of sadness. In her first year, except for the occasional solo trip to the library, she was always inseparable from Harry and Ron. They attended the same classes, ate together, and returned to the common room to finish homework together. But now, things were different. Since the start of third grade, their time together had significantly decreased. Harry and Ron shared the same elective courses, but Hermione's schedule differed from theirs. Moreover, to master the increasingly challenging courses, Hermione had to spend more time in the library. During the day, public classes left little room for communication. Only during lunch, dinner, and before lights out did they have time in the Great Hall and common room to discuss daily happenings. Harry and Ron didn't seem to notice this change deeply, which was unsurprising given their carefree nature. However, Hermione felt the shift profoundly. She even began to ponder the sad prospect of being far apart after they graduated from Hogwarts. With a hint of sadness in her heart, Hermione walked into the library along a familiar route. In the first week of school, the coursework wasn't too heavy, and the library wasn't crowded. Most of the senior students present were Ravenclaws, which was expected, as their average grades were consistently among the best at Hogwarts. As soon as Hermione entered the library, she was surprised to find Professor Blaine there. Moreover, he seemed to be in some trouble, being reprimanded by the librarian. The Hogwarts librarian, Mrs. Pince, resembled a skinny vulture and was notoriously strict. If anyone made a loud noise or damaged her beloved books, they would not escape her criticism. "This is the library, Atticus." Mrs. Pince's dim yellow eyes with shrunken pupils were fixed on Professor Blaine. She didn't care whether Atticus Blaine was the most powerful wizard in the world or not. She angrily declared, "This is not Madame Putafoot's tea shop. If you wish to pursue a romantic relationship, please find another place." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Pince," Professor Blaine replied, smiling awkwardly, without attempting to defend himself. "What happened?" Hermione had initially intended to ask Professor Blaine about the magic that could resist mental attacks, which he had mentioned in Professor Moody's Defense Against the Dark Arts class earlier. But upon hearing Mrs. Pince's words, she froze in her tracks. The next moment, Hermione sprang forward like a startled rabbit, rushing to the person she was most familiar with in the library. "Professor Blaine is in love." "With whom? In the library?" Hermione exclaimed breathlessly, hardly believing her ears. Johnson of Gryffindor, a striking dark-skinned girl, is the star chaser on the Gryffindor Quidditch team. This year, however, the Quidditch matches were cancelled due to the Tri-Wizard tournament. With more free time, Angelina focused on her studies to catch up on lessons she had missed because of her rigorous training schedule. "Oh, it's you, Hermione." Angelina was caught up in the excitement when she noticed Hermione approaching. As Hermione drew nearer, Angelina lowered her voice with a mischievous smile and said, "You're missing the show, Hermione." "Don't keep me in suspense, Angelina. Tell me," Hermione exclaimed, brushing aside the unruly hair that obscured her vision. "Professor Blaine came to the library to borrow some books," Angelina whispered, still giggling. "And then, 2 seventh-year Ravenclaw witches ran up and handed him a love letter." "Oh," Hermione exclaimed with a mix of disbelief and disdain. "Surely Professor Blaine wouldn't be interested in them, right? And why can't they do this somewhere else?" "The best part is," Angelina continued, laughing even harder, "the Ravenclaw students asked Professor Blaine for an autograph. They pulled out lipstick from their bags and wanted him to write their names on their shirts with it." Angelina pointed to a spot on her own shirt, causing Hermione to blush with embarrassment. "You should have seen Professor Blaine's face. I'll never forget it." Hermione, unimpressed, retorted angrily, "Shameless and thoughtless." Meanwhile, Professor Blaine had finally managed to calm Mrs. Pince's ire. He watched her return to her usual desk, placing a few gilded books with moldy covers under the creaking shelves. Sighing, he wiped the sweat from his forehead. Having once been young himself, he understood that the two Ravenclaw witches were merely having fun, but he hadn't expected them to be so audacious, leaving him quite embarrassed. After spending a long time in his office, he had planned to relax in the library before bed. However, with the amused glances around him, he felt too embarrassed to stay any longer. Clutching his book, Atticus Blaine turned to leave, eager to escape the situation. Just as he stepped out of the library, a voice called out from behind him. "Wait, Professor Blaine!" Angelina, still laughing, stood up and called after him. Hermione looked at Angelina in shock, almost believing she was about to hand Professor Blaine a love letter herself. "How often do you see something this entertaining, Hermione?" Angelina explained quietly, noticing Hermione's expression. "Let's have a little fun with him." She grabbed Hermione's arm, and before Mrs. Pince could get upset, pulled her out of the library to intercept Professor Blaine at the door. Hermione noticed Professor Blaine's slightly horrified expression as he looked at her and Angelina, making her wish she could disappear into the floor. "What's going on?" Atticus Blaine asked, raising his eyebrows. He looked at Hermione, whose cheeks were flushed, and Angelina, who was grinning and ready to flee at any moment. Professor Blaine had been teaching at Hogwarts for nearly 2 years, and the students had come to understand his easygoing nature. Outside of class, he was known for his good humor and rarely got angry. "Why did you turn them down, Professor Blaine?" Angelina asked eagerly. "As far as I know, you don't." "I'm sorry, it seems like there might be a misunderstanding or missing context. Could you please provide more of the text or clarify what you would like me to improve?" Chapter 5 and 26, Emotional Views and Requests. Even though Professor Atticus Blaine was known for his talkative nature, Hermione found Angelina's question to be rather audacious. She pursed her lips nervously, bracing herself for what she imagined would be Professor Blaine's thunderous fury. Yet, Angelina's boldness was undeniable. She dared to press on, asking, "Those 2 Ravenclaw students earlier are quite beautiful, aren't they? They're very popular in the college. Since you don't have a girlfriend, why not give it a try?" "I'm a professor," Atticus replied, his expression darkening. "Are you trying to tarnish my reputation, Miss Johnson?" "Oh, I don't think it's a big deal," Angelina retorted, her words as assertive as her Quidditch style. Since Professor Blaine hadn't immediately erupted in anger, it seemed he didn't mind discussing such topics with the young wizards. Sensing an opportunity, Angelina smiled and continued, "Love shouldn't be constrained by identity and status, right? Besides, they're adults. They know what they're doing and can take responsibility for their actions. Love." The corner of Atticus's mouth twitched. This was the first time he had engaged in such a discussion with students at the school. "You're right, Miss Johnson," he conceded, looking a bit helpless but still willing to address the question. "Identity and status shouldn't be barriers to love, but I also have the right to choose, don't I? To put it bluntly, if someone takes a few minutes to write me a love letter, I don't have to immediately consider her my girlfriend. Otherwise, I'd never get anything done." It was an obvious point. Everyone knew Angelina was just teasing, but she persisted. "Then what kind of girl would you choose to be your girlfriend?" Her eyes sparkled with curiosity. "You're the most talented wizard I've ever seen. You might not know this, but many senior witches are curious about the kind of girl you fancy." Discussing such matters with Professor Blaine felt peculiar. Hermione kept her head down, avoiding eye contact with him. However, Angelina's question piqued her interest, and she couldn't help but listen intently. It was indeed a fascinating question. "What kind of girl do I like?" Atticus finally relented. He gazed at the flickering flames of the torch on the wall, momentarily lost in thought. What kind of girl did he like? To be honest, he hadn't considered this question in years. Ever since leaving Grandma Felena and the Muggle orphanage to enter the magical world, he had devoted all his energy to honing his magical skills during his time at Hogwarts. After graduation, he was eager to explore the wider magical world and improve the living conditions of the orphanage's children. When his abilities reached a certain level, Dumbledore had orchestrated his return to Hogwarts. From then on, one event followed another, leaving him little time to ponder such personal matters. Caught up in his thoughts, Atticus was momentarily stunned. He wasn't sure how long he had been lost in contemplation, but when he returned to the present, even Hermione, who was usually shy about such topics, was looking at him with curiosity. Looking at the two young wizards, who were still a head shorter than him, Atticus chuckled and said, "I suppose there isn't a clear standard." "No standard?" Angelina echoed, puzzled. "But surely there must be something, right? For instance, most boys at school like pretty and cute girls." "Beautiful, cute." Hermione pursed her lips, feeling a twinge of insecurity. "Ah, of course, everyone appreciates beauty and charm," Professor Blaine acknowledged with a gentle smile. "Frankly, but this is the nature of men, and I'm afraid it has nothing to do with love. If it were me, I would probably pay more attention to a woman who can resonate with my soul." "Soul resonance?" Hermione inquired. "Exactly. It's essential to have common interests and pursuits. Miss Johnson, you know, love itself is a very mysterious thing. It defies logic. No language can accurately describe it, and there are no standards by which it can be measured." Atticus Blaine smiled. "In short, my belief is that it's better to have less than too much. You need to try your luck to find a woman who can resonate with your soul. Until then, I'd rather invest all my energy in improving my magical abilities. I won't seek a partner just because society dictates that one must have a partner. It's a waste of time and energy." Invisibly, it was as if a bolt of lightning struck Hermione. She looked at Professor Blaine with a blank expression. In an instant, countless thoughts flooded her mind, filling her heart. Professor Blaine's concept was indeed very reasonable, wasn't it? Even Angelina nodded thoughtfully. "All right," Professor Blaine said, brushing dust off his robe as he emerged from the restricted section of the library. "Let's end this topic here. I haven't eaten yet, so I need to get myself something to eat. You two can go about your own business." Angelina turned and walked back into the library. She was also a student in Professor Blaine's physical education class and needed to find some information to complete the homework assigned in last night's class. However, Hermione lingered, not even taking 2 steps into the library. "Is there anything else you want to talk to me about?" Professor Blaine asked, sensing Hermione's hesitation. He had already guessed that she wanted to discuss something privately, so he stopped her. Caught off guard, Hermione hesitated even more. However, Professor Blaine's calm eyes gave her courage. She took a deep breath, turned around and nodded. Professor Blaine snorted softly, understanding that Hermione wasn't interested in discussing love any further. She likely had something important on her mind. He looked around, gestured for Hermione to follow him, and led her to a section of dusty corridors. The air was filled with the smell of decay, and the stone sculptures lining the corridor appeared eerie in the darkness. Hermione shrank back in fear, not daring to let her eyes wander. "What's the matter, Hermione?" Atticus asked, standing in the bright moonlight that streamed into the castle. "Well, there's something." Hermione hesitated before continuing. "You mentioned in Professor Moody's class today that there's a type of magic that can resist mental spell attacks and the unforgivable curses, but you forgot to mention—" "Oh," Atticus exclaimed, patting his forehead apologetically. "I'm sorry, I did forget, but—" He paused, a smile playing on his lips. "But I think you're not just here for that. It's okay. Be honest. What do you really want to ask?" Hermione realized her flimsy excuse hadn't fooled Professor Blaine, but she hadn't expected him to call her out so directly. For a moment she was at a loss for words. Fortunately, Professor Blaine was patient, waiting without pressing her. "Sorry, Professor, I actually—" Hermione clutched her schoolbag tightly, lowering her head in embarrassment. After a long pause, she whispered, "Actually, I want to ask if there's any way. Are you willing to accept those who— little wizards who have given up on physical education classes? I mean, let's give them another chance." Silence filled the room, heavy and oppressive. In this quiet, Hermione's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she lowered her head further and further until her chin nearly touched her chest. "And what about Mr. Ron Weasley?" Atticus Blaine finally asked after a long pause, his voice calm and accompanied by a gentle smile. End of this chapter. Chapter 527, An Unexpected Situation. "Oh no!" Hermione exclaimed nervously, her voice trembling. She was so frightened that she barely registered her own words. Professor Atticus Blaine's calm, penetrating purple eyes seemed to see through any falsehoods. Hermione lowered her head, her cheeks flushed as if they were on fire. She hesitated, then said, "And see, Miss Dean Lavender, a lot of people regret giving up gym class, Professor Blaine. If you could give them another chance." Her voice faltered under Professor Blaine's steady gaze, which felt as heavy as a mountain pressing down on her. In the suffocating silence, a faint whine could be heard, as soft as a breeze brushing against the skin. Hermione didn't notice it, but Atticus Blaine turned his attention to a dilapidated classroom with a rusty door hinge, his expression subtly shifting. "Of course Ron regrets it too. They didn't expect my class to be interesting?" Professor Blaine interjected calmly, withdrawing his gaze. Hermione's heart sank. She had anticipated his response. As expected, Professor Blaine sighed softly and spoke slowly. "Your noble character is touching, Hermione, but I think you knew what my answer would be before you approached me, didn't you?" Hermione's cheeks burned, her slightly protruding front teeth biting into her lower lip, her eyes tinged with red. This was indeed a difficult situation for her. She knew she couldn't persuade Professor Blaine to give Ron another chance. She had always adhered to the rules, yet here she was, hoping Professor Blaine would bend them. "Everyone wants to improve, but hard work alone isn't always enough," Professor Blaine said earnestly. "We need vision, wisdom, luck, opportunity, and a series of other factors to change our destiny. Do you understand?" Hermione nodded vigorously. Professor Blaine was implying that the students who dropped out lacked these qualities. Observing Hermione's downcast expression and reddened eyes, Atticus Blaine continued, "Life is a wonderful journey, Hermione. No one can dictate how to live it happily and meaningfully. You might think your friends lost a precious opportunity by leaving my class, but from a broader perspective, it might be beneficial for them. Everyone's life is their own to control, and you can't interfere." Professor Blaine's words left Hermione bewildered. To her, becoming better was the key to happiness and self-worth. For a young wizard, mediocrity was terrifying. How could losing such an opportunity be good for Ron? "Well," Hermione murmured, still grappling with Professor Blaine's words. At that moment, what she had dismissed as the wind whistling through the corridor window became clear. It wasn't the wind at all, but a painful whine. Alarmed, Hermione turned to the cobweb-covered classroom door behind her, her mouth opening silently. "Who's in there?" she called out. No one answered, but the painful whining persisted. Hermione could hear someone inside the classroom trying desperately to suppress their cries, but the pain was clearly beyond endurance, impossible to stifle with sheer willpower. "Is someone hurt?" she asked, her voice tinged with urgency. Hermione stepped back, the color draining from her face, leaving her pale and shaken. She couldn't help but tug on Professor Blaine's sleeve, her voice trembling as she asked, "Oh." Atticus Blaine's mouth twitched slightly, and he appeared momentarily speechless. "No one was injured. How should I put it? This kind of situation is indeed quite rare. It's the first time I've encountered it, but now that I have—" Atticus frowned. "There's really nothing I can do about it." Hermione raised her head, her eyes fixed on Professor Blaine's face. She had never seen the usually confident and composed professor speak in such an awkward tone. What had happened in the classroom to leave him so flustered? The professors all seemed equally uneasy. "There's something going on inside, Hermione. I have to go in and deal with it. Look." Hermione was taken aback. She hadn't expected Professor Blaine to dismiss her so abruptly, and disappointment flickered in her eyes. She nodded slightly and began to walk back the way she had come. Regardless of the situation, she knew she didn't need to worry about Professor Blaine. Whether at Hogwarts or in the wider magical world, nothing could harm him, probably. "Can I ask what's going on inside, Professor Blaine?" Hermione paused unexpectedly, turning to look at Professor Blaine, who was rolling up his sleeves, and asked coldly. Click! The rusty door handle broke off, and a flurry of panicked, rustling sounds emanated from the classroom. Atticus was about to push the door open when Hermione's sudden question halted him. "Oh." Glancing at the young witch, who was watching him with a worried expression, Atticus pondered for a few seconds before replying in a tone that was hard to decipher. "There's a house elf hiding in the classroom." "House elf!" Hermione's eyes widened in surprise, and she repeated the words breathlessly. Yes, Atticus nodded slightly. This house elf is, well, probably in labor and, well, likely having a difficult delivery. I'm afraid she won't survive without help. In the dim light, Hermione's mouth fell open in shock. But why is it here? She had completely forgotten Professor Blaine's request for her to leave. Her movements were much more agile as she ran back to him, her bright orange eyes wide with concern. Why hasn't anyone helped it? Madame Pomfrey, shouldn't it go to the school hospital? The hospital is here to serve the staff and you little wizards, Miss Granger, Professor Blaine replied, amused by Hermione's earnestness. He chuckled softly. House elves are not the ones served by the hospital. Oh, no one cares about them, Hermione exclaimed, recalling Creature, who had prepared sumptuous meals for them at Sirius's house, and how he had been accidentally burned and seriously injured by Professor Blaine's magic during the Quidditch final, despite doing nothing wrong. She also remembered Winky, who had been ruthlessly abandoned by Barty Crouch, the head of the Department of International Magical Cooperation. Even if Hogwarts, like the outside world, doesn't give house elves holidays and wages, someone should consider this situation. Hagrid should help. He has a unique love for magical creatures. He will always help them. I will go find him now. Objectively speaking, Hagrid's passion is for those magical animals that appear very dangerous. I'm afraid he doesn't have much interest in creatures like house elves, Atticus replied. Atticus Blaine spoke calmly. Don't worry about it, Hermione. By the time you get Hagrid, the poor house elf inside might already be beyond help. Let me see if I can do something to assist this elf. End of chapter. Chapter 5 and 28. But Hermione appeared utterly lost, panic evident in her eyes. It wasn't her fault. After all, no class at Hogwarts had ever prepared her for such a situation. Professor Blaine had already regained his composure and with a grating noise opened the door. A strong, almost suffocating smell of rotting wood hit her face. She choked, coughing repeatedly, and quickly covered her mouth. Professor Blaine had already entered the classroom. Seeing this, Hermione suppressed the anxiety in her heart and hurriedly followed. The room was shrouded in darkness, illuminated only by the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains. It took Hermione a moment to adjust her eyes to the dimness. She squinted, carefully observing her surroundings, and discovered it was a semicircular room, unlike the classrooms they used daily. In the center was a pile of decayed wood, likely the remnants of old tables and chairs. Over the centuries, Hogwarts had many such classrooms, once used, then abandoned for reasons unknown. It might have taken hundreds of years for them to fall into disuse. The classroom they were in now seemed destined for the same fate. Despite the dreadful view, Hermione's steps on the floor returned a soft sensation from the accumulated dust, leading her to this conclusion. A strange environment can easily unsettle anyone. Hermione instinctively reached out to tug on Professor Blaine's sleeve for support, but quickly withdrew her hand, anger flaring within her. The school's indifference to the rights of house elves, where a pregnant elf would hide in such a place to give birth, made her grit her teeth in frustration. Atticus Blaine drew his wand, casting a soft white light from its tip, his gaze fixed on a raised curtain from which intermittent whining and crying emanated. "Come out, little one." By the wand's light, Hermione noticed a dark trail on the ground leading from the pile of rotten sawdust to the curtains. She squinted, and upon realizing what it was, her expression turned to worry. It was blood, the blood from the house elf mixed with the dust on the ground. Before they entered, the house elf had crawled out from its makeshift nest of sawdust and rags, hiding behind the curtain. House elves cannot resist the orders of their masters. At Hogwarts, the students and staff are the masters of house elves. The tattered curtain shook, and a frail little creature crawled out, using all four limbs. The moment Hermione saw the elf clearly, she covered her mouth to stifle a cry, her eyes immediately welling with tears. The house elf wore only what resembled an apron, now soaked with blood. Something protruded from the elf's lower body, and Hermione quickly understood what it was. "Great, great, Professor Blaine, respectful young lady, Miss Witch." Even in such a dire state, the house elf clung to the wall, trying to stand and salute them. Ruigia, what can I do for you?" The elf, pale from excessive bleeding, spoke with a strained voice. "Lie down!" Hermione's tears flowed freely as she shouted, almost at the top of her lungs. "Is there any way, Professor Blaine? We have to help it." "Calm down, Miss Granger." Atticus glanced at Hermione, adopting the serious tone he was accustomed to using. In class, Atticus Blaine raised an eyebrow as he looked at the house elf. "Is your name Riga?" he asked. Riga nodded timidly, but as the esteemed Professor Blaine approached, panic washed over the elf. "Oh, Riga is dirty, the great Professor Blaine," Riga cried. "Riga is not just a qualified elf. Riga has brought trouble to the great Professor Blaine and Miss Witch." "What are you talking about?" Hermione was nearly overwhelmed by Riga's distress. She wanted to ask the little elf if it understood its situation and why it was still apologizing to them. "Lie down and move slowly. This is my order, Riga," Atticus instructed, glancing at the emotional Hermione with a calm demeanor. "And you, Miss Granger, if you can't control your emotions, then I'm afraid I must ask you to leave." Hermione's sobs ceased abruptly. She turned to Professor Blaine, her eyes filled with disbelief and anger. Was it possible that Professor Blaine was unmoved by this scene? Did he, like other wizards, believe it was acceptable to use elves in such a manner? Riga continued to sob softly, lamenting that it had caused trouble for the great Professor Blaine. It felt like an unqualified and shameful elf, yet it obeyed Professor Blaine's instructions, slowly lying on a clean, soft cushion that had magically appeared behind it. "Quiet now. Conserve your energy," Atticus ordered Riga again. He crouched beside the elf, examining it with a slightly solemn expression. Hermione took a few deep breaths to calm her emotions, realizing that Professor Blaine was the only one who could make a difference in this situation. "What exactly is going on, Professor?" Hermione asked, her voice trembling as she avoided looking at the distressing scene. Instead, she focused on Professor Blaine's serious profile and Riga's pained expression. "Well, according to my judgment," Atticus hesitated before continuing, "to put it simply, the baby is too large and is stuck." "Then what should we do now?" Hermione asked, acknowledging that even the most skilled individuals have their limitations. Atticus scratched his head, clearly distressed. What serious wizard had ever dealt with such a situation? The house elf's child was emerging feet first, and he feared that pulling it out roughly might endanger both elves. The soft cushion he had conjured was already stained with blood, and time was running out. "Miss Granger," Professor Blaine's steady voice helped calm Hermione. She took a deep breath and asked, "What can I do, Professor?" Atticus rummaged through his space bag and retrieved a bottle of potion with a blue glow, handing it to Hermione. "Give this to the elf. It might help it regain some energy." Hermione quickly uncorked the bottle. With one hand, she gently supported Riga's head, and with the other, she offered the potion to the elf's lips. Riga seemed frightened, as if believing that drinking a wizard's potion was a shameful waste. However, Hermione didn't give it a chance to refuse, pouring the potion into Riga's mouth without hesitation. Meanwhile, Atticus stood up, drawing his wand and tracing a complex, mysterious pattern in the air. Dreamy, bright starlight emerged from the wand's tip, drifting toward Riga like falling snow and quickly merging into the elf's overwhelmed body. Hermione watched, unsure of the magic Professor Blaine was performing, but hopeful it would help. Atticus Blaine was casting a spell, clearly one related to healing. She observed as Regina's furry, pale body began to regain its color at a pace visible to the naked eye. The grayness in Regina's lantern-sized eyes gradually faded, replaced by a growing brightness. "Oh, it looks like it's working, Professor!" Hermione exclaimed joyfully. She placed her palm gently against the back of Regina's head, feeling the elf's body, which had been cold from blood loss, gradually warming up. She could sense the rapid return of vitality to the once weak creature. "You're on your own, little one," Professor Blaine said softly, maintaining his focus on the spell. He gazed into Regina's eyes, offering reassurance. After 5 intense minutes, Regina let out a high-pitched, sharp howl of pain, slipping from the mat to the floor. End of this chapter. Chapter 529, A Sad Fate. The newborn house elf was about the size of 2 or 3 goblins. Its body hair was milky white and incredibly soft, while its skin was a delicate shade of pink. After enduring numerous challenges, the little creature finally arrived, rolling off the mat and onto the ground. It lay there with its eyes tightly shut, appearing to be in a deep slumber. "Oh!" Hermione gasped, tears welling up in her eyes. She covered her mouth, her eyelashes glistening with large teardrops, as if she had just witnessed a miracle. Struggling to contain her sobs, she whispered, "It's incredible." Atticus Blaine remained silent, his gaze fixed on the newborn house elf with a furrowed brow. "It's a little girl, isn't it?" Hermione exclaimed excitedly. "She looks just like her mother." Atticus glanced at Hermione, pursing his lips in resignation. He then crouched down, extending a finger to gently prod the elf's belly. "Oh, it's resting," Hermione protested, casting an angry look at Professor Blaine. "Don't touch it." A few lines of frustration appeared on Atticus's forehead as he continued to gently poke and rub the elf's belly. Despite his efforts, the elf's eyes remained closed, and its skin, once pink and translucent, began to shift towards a deep purple hue. Hermione, anxious, tried to grab Professor Blaine's hand, but he blocked her with his elbow. "Look carefully, Miss Granger," he said in a grave tone. "This elf isn't sleeping, it's suffocating." "Asphyxia?" Hermione was stunned, quickly examining the elf on the ground. She noticed something was indeed amiss. The newborn elf's chest wasn't rising at all. Could it be that all their efforts had been in vain? Had they failed to save the unfortunate house elf mother and child? Hermione's face turned pale, as if struck by lightning. At that moment, Rika, the house elf who had been teetering on the brink of life and death, weakly climbed up. Her large, lantern-like eyes flickered with emotions, confusion, fear, and pleading. Yet, she said nothing, merely staring blankly at Professor Blaine. To be honest, Atticus wasn't sure how wizards typically handled such situations. A myriad of thoughts raced through his mind, and ultimately, he decided to try a muggle method. "I'm not sure I can save it," Hermione heard Professor Blaine say to Rika. She watched as he used his hand to clear the sticky liquid from the corner of the elf's mouth. Then, he picked up the newborn elf, turned it over, and gently patted its back, pausing occasionally to rub it. "This is the Muggle way." Hermione, familiar with Muggle life, recognized the technique from educational programs she had seen on TV. Excitedly, she exclaimed, "Will it work, Professor Blaine?" Atticus responded to her first question with a nod, but remained silent on the latter. He focused intently on his task, ignoring Hermione's chatter about the TV programs she had watched. In the decaying, dilapidated classroom, the rustling movements continued unabated. Life and death hung in the balance, eagerly awaiting the final outcome. Hermione had never experienced such a long and painful wait. She stood by, watching anxiously as Professor Blaine worked to save the elf, feeling helpless. The newborn elf remained motionless, and even Hermione's bright orange eyes began to fill with despair. She was overwhelmed with sadness, her gaze fixed on Professor Blaine's hands as if under a petrification spell. Just when dark despair threatened to completely envelop Hermione's heart, she suddenly heard a faint cough. It paused for a moment, then grew stronger. The atmosphere was intense. Professor Atticus Blaine had just made Hermione realize that the voice she heard was not a figment of her imagination. The sound of a child's cry echoed in her ears like a melody from nature, illuminating the world around her as she peered out from the dim classroom. "Alive!" Hermione exclaimed, her voice filled with joy as she jumped up and down, tears streaming down her cheeks. Yet, curiously, Professor Blaine did not share her enthusiasm. He squinted, focusing intently on the house elf that had come to life in his palm. An enigmatic light flickered in his lavender eyes, unnoticed by anyone else. "For you," Atticus said, leaning down to return the elf to its mother. The elf, named Ruigia, cradled her child, still appearing dazed and fearful. She instinctively accepted the child, bowing in a state of shock. "It needs clothes," Hermione gasped, looking around frantically. Finding nothing suitable except for the tattered curtains, she bit her lip in thought. With a flick of her wand, she cut a piece of fabric from her robe and gently draped it over the newborn elf. Professor Blaine raised an eyebrow at this gesture. "Respected master," a timid, childlike voice suddenly filled the classroom. It was the newborn elf, struggling to stand for the first time. It wobbled but managed to stay upright, clutching the cloth Hermione had given it. Bowing respectfully, it addressed Hermione. "Oh, it can talk!" Hermione exclaimed in surprise. Unlike human infants, some magical creatures are born with full consciousness and innate skills. Atticus explained calmly, observing Hermione's astonishment. They inherit knowledge through their bloodline. That's incredible, Hermione said, her enthusiasm quickly turning to alarm as she realized something. She stepped back, eyes wide with fear. You are mistaken, little one. I am not your master. I'm afraid it wasn't mistaken. Miss Granger, Professor Blaine interjected calmly. House elves receive clothing under two circumstances, when dismissed by their original owner or when they recognize a new master. This garment will accompany the elf for life. Congratulations, Miss Granger. You now have a house elf. No, Hermione cried out, panic rising in her voice. I don't need a house elf, and I don't want to be anyone's master. Before she could finish, the newborn elf, still unsteady on its feet, threw itself at Hermione's feet, sobbing and pleading. Master, don't drive me away. I belong to you. At that moment, something unexpected happened. Ruigia, the house elf, looked deeply at the child kneeling before Hermione. She took a few breaths and with great respect addressed them both. Great Professor Blaine and esteemed Miss Granger, is there anything Ruigia can do for you? What? Hermione stammered. What service? Oh, I don't need it. Wait, Ruigia, you need to rest. What about your child? There is nothing left, Professor Blaine replied calmly. With a respectful bow to Atticus and Hermione, Ruigia vanished from the dilapidated classroom with a sharp crack. Where did she go? Hermione asked, her voice a mix of confusion and awe. Perhaps back to the kitchen to tend to the stove, or maybe to clean up, Professor Blaine suggested, his tone as composed as ever. Or do the laundry for the students and staff in this castle, Professor Blaine said, his lips pursed and his tone laden with complexity. But they're children, Hermione interjected, her voice strained as if the words were being forced from her throat. Professor Blaine chuckled, a sound that seemed to mask the weight in his heart. Ha ha, Miss Granger, he began. You must understand that house elves do not share the same traditions of nurturing their young as humans do. Oh, of course. He paused, lowering his gaze to the young elf clinging to Hermione's shoelaces. If their offspring do not immediately find an owner, the elves will care for them until they find a wizard willing to accept them. End of this chapter. Chapter 530, How to Deal with It. Hermione stared at the new house elf at her feet, then glanced at Professor Blaine, too stunned to speak. In the quiet, dimly lit classroom, the only sounds were the elf's faint pleas and the night wind whispering outside the window. But what should I do with it, Professor Blaine? Hermione asked, trying to shake her foot free, but the elf clung tightly, fearing abandonment. I can't take care of it, Professor. I have to teach, Hermione said, her voice tinged with desperation. Oh, you don't have to look after it, Hermione, Professor Blaine reassured her, a slight smile playing on his lips. House elves are remarkably resilient. Even though this little one is newly born, it can take care of itself. It possesses the full-blood magic of an elf, so... He paused, considering his words. You just need to give it orders. Give an order? Hermione repeated, bewildered. The elf at her feet brightened at the mention of order, finally releasing her shoelaces. It stood up, albeit unsteadily, and looked up at her with wide, clear eyes that seemed to take up a third of its face. Master Granger, order! Serve! It chirped. It knows my name, Hermione exclaimed in surprise. Of course it knows your name. When you gave it clothes, a mysterious contract was formed between you. Speaking of which, you should give it a name. This is your responsibility. Professor Blaine explained, stepping back to leave Hermione alone with the elf. Hermione instinctively wanted to refuse. Naming the little one felt like a task for its mother, not her. But remembering Regina, who had left without a second thought, Hermione pressed her lips together. The way house elves inherited their roles was beyond her imagination. These creatures were more pitiable than she had realized, their enslavement more profound. Okay, a name. Let me think. Hermione sighed, looking at the elf, whose demeanor seemed to embody humility. Anger flickered in her orange eyes. Dom, she said suddenly, after a few moments of thought. If you don't mind, you can be called Dom. Atticus Blaine raised an eyebrow. Dom, the ancient rune for freedom. Dom, the elf repeated clumsily, bowing even lower, though its excitement was evident from its large ears. The name given by the great and kind Master Granger, Dom, Master! Dom tilted its head, gazing up at Hermione's knees. What can Dom do for the great Mistress Granger? Dom will always belong to the great Mistress Granger. Don't say that, Hermione shouted, her voice filled with anger. I'm not your master, Dom. I just gave you some clothes and a name. That's all. You don't belong to anyone. Understand? You are free. You can do whatever you want. If you want to find your mother, I'll help you. However, Hermione's fierce reaction was met with an even more intense response from Dom. The little elf, who could barely speak, threw itself at her feet, tears streaming down its face, soaking Hermione's pants. Oh, don't cry, Dom. Master Granger gave the order, Dom exclaimed, suddenly leaping up, eyes shining with excitement. Hermione looked at Professor Blaine, bewildered. It is the destiny of house elves to serve wizards. This idea is deeply ingrained, Atticus Blaine said calmly. Seeing Hermione's desire to argue, he continued. This matter is not as simple as it seems. This kind of servitude is deeply embedded in their souls. House entrance swung open, and Hermione stepped inside, her face flushed with determination. She spotted Harry and Ron at their usual spot near the fireplace, and made her way over, her expression a mix of frustration and resolve. Hermione, where have you been? Ron asked, looking up from his completed fortune chart. We thought Mrs. Pince might have locked you in the library. Hermione shook her head, her curls bouncing with emotion. I was talking to Professor Blaine about the house elves, she replied, her voice tinged with exasperation. It's just so unfair how they're treated, and I can't stand it. Harry put down his quill, intrigued. What did Professor Blaine say? He agrees with me in principle, Hermione said, her eyes flashing with passion. But he thinks it's more complicated than it seems. He said that before we can fight for their rights, we need to convince the elves themselves to want those rights. Ron raised an eyebrow. And how did that go? Hermione sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. Not as well as I'd hoped. But I'm not giving up. I just need to figure out how to help Dom, the baby house elf. Professor Blaine suggested letting him work in the kitchen with the other elves, but he's so young. Harry nodded thoughtfully. Maybe you could keep him in the dormitory for now, like Professor Blaine suggested, at least until you figure out a better solution. Hermione considered this, her brow furrowed in thought. I suppose that's the best option for now, she conceded, but I won't stop trying to make things better for him. Ron gave her a supportive smile. We know you won't, Hermione. You're the most determined person we know. As the three friends settled back into their work, the common room buzzed with the quiet hum of students finishing their assignments. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth, casting a comforting glow over the room. Despite the challenges they faced, there was a sense of camaraderie and shared purpose that made even the most daunting tasks seem a little more manageable. The fat lady's portrait swung open, and Ron's attention immediately shifted in that direction. As expected, it was Hermione returning from the library. Ron raised his eyebrows, preparing to greet her, but his hand froze midair, and his expression turned serious. Oh, what happened to her? He wondered aloud. Hermione appeared quite disheveled. A large section of her robe's hem was torn, and instead of slinging her school bag over her shoulder as usual, she clutched it tightly to her chest. Her demeanor was that of someone who had just committed a theft, her eyes wide with fear. Harry, who had been glancing around the room, noticed her unusual state, and his expression immediately grew concerned. As Hermione entered the common room, she quickly spotted Harry and Ron by the fireplace. She approached them, attempting to act nonchalant, but Neville, who was daydreaming nearby, also noticed her peculiar behavior. It was clear she was hiding something. What happened? Ron asked eagerly as soon as Hermione sat down, his eyes fixed on the school bag she held protectively. Don't tell us you went and stole something. Hermione shot Ron a sharp look. He had no idea that she had gone to see Professor Atticus Blaine on his behalf that evening, only to find herself in a predicament. I need help, she admitted, glancing around nervously before taking a deep breath. End of this chapter. Hogwarts for several years, this was beyond anything he could have imagined. Hermione, are you sure about this? Harry asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and concern. Hermione nodded, her expression resolute. Yes, I'm sure. Professor Blaine explained everything to me. The house elves are in a dire situation, and they need our help. It's not just about freeing them, it's about ensuring their survival. Ron shook his head, still trying to wrap his mind around the idea. But why you, Hermione? Why did Professor Blaine involve you in this? Hermione sighed, her eyes reflecting a mix of determination and worry. Because he knows I care about their rights. He trusts me to keep this secret and to help them discreetly. It's not something that can be handled openly, not yet. Harry and Ron exchanged another glance, their expressions softening as they realized the weight of the responsibility Hermione had taken on. "All right," Harry said finally. "We're with you. Hermione, whatever you need, we'll help." Ron nodded in agreement, though he still looked a bit bewildered. "Yeah, we're in this together. Just, let's be careful, okay?" Hermione smiled, a hint of relief in her eyes. "Thank you, both of you. I knew I could count on you." As the three friends sat in the dimly lit lounge, the flickering shadows from the dying fire danced across their faces. They knew they were embarking on a journey that was as dangerous as it was noble, but with each other's support, they felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Atticus Blaine had been at Hogwarts for over 3 years, and during that time, he had encountered many strange tales. Yet, after hearing Hermione's story tonight, he found it utterly absurd. Hermione, too, was staring at her school bag, a look of embarrassment in her eyes. "What are you going to do, Hermione?" Harry asked cautiously. "I originally planned to return Dom to its mother, the elf named Ricardo," Hermione replied without hesitation, glancing at Ron. "But I don't know where the school kitchen is." "Oh," Ron said, immediately grasping Hermione's intention. He hesitated before continuing. "Fred and George know. They often sneak food from the kitchen. I've asked them for tips before, but they wouldn't tell me." "But," Ron frowned, eyeing Hermione's school bag, "do you really want to return this elf to its mother?" Harry understood Ron's skepticism. What had happened to the house elf? The complicated mother-child relationship, along with Professor Blaine's teachings, made Harry suspect that returning the elf to its mother might just be Hermione's wishful thinking. "It was just born." Hermione's voice cut sharply through the quiet common room. "It needs care, and it must return to its mother." Hermione's schoolbag squirmed, and Dom inside seemed eager to make a sound. However, due to Hermione's instructions, it remained silent and still. "Oh, come on, Hermione," Ron said impatiently, recognizing Hermione's familiar stubbornness. "Do you think elves are like wizards? Professor Blaine has explained that house elves are inherently obedient. They are born to serve. No one is born loving cooking, mopping, and doing laundry, Weasley," Hermione retorted angrily. Harry, too, felt there was something off about Ron's statement. He considered mentioning Dobby as an example, but hesitated, fearing it might fuel some of Hermione's unrealistic ideas, so he swallowed his words. Hermione and Ron were glaring at each other, a sight Harry had grown accustomed to. "But what if the house elf named Ryga doesn't want her child?" Harry asked hesitantly. His words were carefully chosen. Ron was right about one thing. You couldn't equate house elves with wizards. If this was the nature of elf parent-child relationships, Hermione might not be able to change it. Hermione bit her lip, falling silent. From her demeanor, Harry sensed she understood the situation. Although the mother didn't want the child, and the child was indifferent to the mother, it was hard to accept that a stranger who merely gave you a piece of clothing could become your master. Despite losing his parents to Voldemort early on, Harry at least knew they loved him and were willing to sacrifice their lives for him. "I can't let Dom go to the kitchen to work with the house elves," Hermione declared firmly. "At the very least, I have to teach it to fight for its own rights." "That's great," Ron said, clapping his hands sarcastically. "You plan to keep it in the dormitory, right? I bet by noon tomorrow, all of Hogwarts will know you're raising a domesticated puppy in the dormitory. What would Professor McGonagall say?" Ron's words struck a nerve with Hermione. With her intelligence, she knew Professor McGonagall wouldn't allow it, and Parvati and Lavender likely wouldn't keep it a secret. This was an elf, not a bug hiding in the cracks of the wall. There was no way they wouldn't notice. Moreover, she had no right to keep a talking elf in the shared dormitory. Silence fell once more. Hermione stared at her schoolbag, biting her lower lip until it was bloodshot. Seeing her distress, Ron licked his lips a few times, unsure of what to say next. Harry felt equally uncomfortable, though he couldn't quite grasp why Hermione was so determined to help the elf. Despite this, Hermione was his good friend, and he knew he wouldn't have overcome past challenges without her support. Hermione had always been the brightest among them, consistently coming up with brilliant solutions when faced with problems. Seeing her look so helpless now made Harry feel uneasy. "Let's go!" Harry suddenly exclaimed, breaking the tense atmosphere. He quickly gathered the half-written paper from the table, tucked it into his bag, and pulled out the invisibility cloak. "Where?" Hermione asked, her eyes shifting from the cloak in Harry's hand to his determined green eyes. "Let's go find Hagrid for help," Harry replied simply. "Hagrid used to secretly raise creatures in the castle when he was a student. He has experience with this sort of thing. Maybe he can offer some advice. Come on, we have potions class first thing tomorrow morning, and Snape is just waiting for us to be late." With that, Harry took Hermione's arm and headed for the door. Ron shrugged helplessly, but followed along. "That's why he was fired," he muttered under his breath. End of this chapter. Chapter 532, The Stubborn Hermione. When it came to sneaking out at night to visit Hagrid, Harry, Ron, and Hermione were well versed in the art. With Percy having graduated, their main concern was avoiding Filch and his ever-watchful cat, Mrs. Norris. Fortunately, luck was on their side tonight, as Mrs. Norris seemed to be occupied elsewhere. As they made their way downstairs, they encountered several groups of younger students wandering the castle. Hermione, unable to tolerate such behavior, was on the verge of removing the invisibility cloak to reprimand the first years, but Ron wisely intervened. "Don't get involved, Hermione. You're not a prefect yet," Ron cautioned. "The current president of the student union doesn't care at all," Hermione grumbled, crouching as she watched the younger students pass by. "The school just ignores this. It's something Professor Blaine should address." Hermione's dissatisfaction with Professor Atticus Blaine was evident, and she had been vocal about it. However, Harry reminded her that they were also breaking school rules. The invisibility cloak was barely large enough to cover the three of them, and as they stumbled across the grounds, their trousers became soaked with night dew. Hagrid's hut, nestled at the edge of the Forbidden Forest, still had lights on. Hagrid, accustomed to late nights, was awake. They navigated the muddy vegetable garden and knocked on his door. A loud barking erupted from inside, followed by scratching sounds against the door. "Quiet, Fang," Hagrid scolded his black hound, quickly opening the door. As soon as it swung open, Harry removed the invisibility cloak from his head. "Ah, it's you three," Hagrid said, raising his eyebrows but not looking surprised, as if he had anticipated their visit. Harry noticed that each of Hagrid's fingers was wrapped in bandages, appearing swollen and thicker than usual. "What happened to your hands, Hagrid?" Harry asked with concern. "Just a little injury," Hagrid replied vaguely, waving them inside. "Come in quickly. If anyone finds you here, I'll have to report you." The injuries were undoubtedly from the blast-ended Scroots, a new creature Hagrid had introduced during the summer. As they entered, Fang rushed to Hermione, sniffing at her school bag. Hermione clutched it tightly, using one hand to fend off Fang's curious nose. Hagrid placed a pot of water on the stove and rummaged in the kitchen for something to offer his late-night visitors. "Who might find us?" Ron inquired with interest. "Professor Moody. He comes by every day," Hagrid replied. Harry and Hermione exchanged surprised glances. "He patrols the grounds daily?" Harry asked. "Not just the grounds," Hagrid said, setting a plate of rock-hard fudge on the table. He nudged Fang away from Hermione's school bag and continued, "He's a good man. He helps me patrol the Forbidden Forest, which gives me more time to care for the blast-ended Scroots. You should be grateful. With Professor Moody around, you don't have to worry about anyone sneaking onto the campus." Hagrid settled onto his bed, which creaked under his weight, and looked at the trio. "So, what brings you here? You usually don't visit unless there's a problem," felt a little ashamed. However, now was not the time to dwell on this. Both Harry and Ron turned their attention to Hermione. "I need your help with something, Hagrid," Hermione said, taking a deep breath. "Of course," Hagrid replied, tilting his head. He had already noticed something unusual about Hermione's school bag and was eyeing it with interest. Hermione glanced at the window for a few seconds, ensuring no one was peeking in. Satisfied, she pursed her lips, swallowed, and unzipped her school bag to reveal the little creature inside. It must be said that house elf cubs are incredibly cute. Whether it was Dobby, Winky, or Creature, none of the elves Harry knew were as adorable as Hermione's little one. "Oh, don't move, Yaya. That's not a goblin!" Hermione exclaimed as Yaya whimpered, baring its teeth and making a crawling, attacking motion. This frightened the newborn Dom, who stood trembling on the ground, facing a creature 10 times its size. If it hadn't been for Mistress Granger's order, Dom might have fled. They hadn't seen it clearly in the common room before, but now both Harry and Ron were staring at the cowering Dom with wide eyes, their expressions full of surprise. "A house elf," Hagrid said, standing up from the bed in astonishment. He gently pushed Yaya aside, squatted down, and looked at Dom with his dark eyes wide open. He even raised his fingers, as thick as carrots, to gently fiddle with Dom's chin, observing it carefully. "It's a cub, isn't it, Hermione? I guess it's just been born," Hagrid said. To Dom, Hagrid was an out-and-out giant. Before Dom could faint from fright, Hermione scooped him up in her arms and glared at Hagrid for his roughness. "Where did you get this?" Hagrid asked, shrugging his shoulders. He then noticed that the cloth on the newborn elf and Hermione's wizard robe were missing a piece, making his expression quite interesting. "You became its mother, didn't you, Hermione?" Ron burst into laughter, and even Harry couldn't help but smile. "Don't be afraid, Dom. That's Hagrid. He's my friend. He just looks scary, but he's actually a very nice person," Hermione comforted gently. "Mistress Granger's friend," Dom said, feeling that staying in Hermione's arms was inappropriate. He slipped from her embrace, still scared, but bowed deeply to Hagrid. "Dear Mr. Hagrid, what can Dom do for you? Dom can do a lot of things." "If I may," Hagrid said with a grin, "the dishes in the kitchen haven't been washed yet." "Hagrid!" Hermione shouted angrily. She held Dom, who was trembling with joy, and lifted him back into her arms. "You don't have to work for anyone, Dom. You're just a kid." "Now I know why Mum always wanted a house elf," Ron chuckled, finding the scene amusing. "They are so hard-working." "I was just kidding, Hermione," Hagrid said, raising his hands in an innocent gesture. Professor Blaine's evaluation of Hagrid was spot on. Harry still remembered how, in their first year, Hagrid's attitude towards the little dragon Norbert was much gentler than towards Dom. He thought of himself as Norbert's mother. "Tell me about it," Hagrid said, realizing he shouldn't touch on Hermione's sensitive nerves. He grabbed Yaya's ear and dragged him to the other side of the room, then turned back to ask, "Where on earth did you get this little guy?" So Hermione recounted the story she had told Harry and Ron to Hagrid. "It's amazing," Hagrid exclaimed with admiration after hearing Hermione's story. "Professor Blaine, a wizard as powerful as him, is actually willing to go to great lengths to save a house elf in labor. The same goes for Professor Dumbledore. These great people never discriminate against others easily, even if it's a house elf." "Atticus Blaine still feels the need to save," Hermione exclaimed angrily. "But he watched a house elf who had just given birth go to work," she continued, her voice rising with indignation. "He even asked me to order Doom to work in the school kitchen." Hermione muttered a litany of grievances, including the old creature from Sirius's family, the cruel treatment Barty Crouch from the Department of International Magical Cooperation inflicted on his house elf, Winky, and Professor Blaine's indifferent attitude towards Regia and her son after saving them. "They all take it for granted," Hermione said fiercely. "They think house elves deserve to be enslaved by wizards just because they obey." "Hermione," Hagrid interjected patiently, "wizards like Professor Blaine don't believe that any creature is born to be enslaved. The one who doesn't fully understand the situation is you, not Professor Blaine. For centuries, house elves have been regarded as private property by wizards. You want to fight for their rights, to let them enjoy holidays and rewards. But how do you convince their people? Most of the people who own house elves are powerful individuals like Lucius Malfoy. They aren't sus. Oh, easy to persuade. End of this chapter. Chapter 533. Hagrid's words not only surprised Harry and Ron, but even Hermione frowned. Once again, Hermione realized that the perspective of an adult wizard differed significantly from that of a young wizard. She was determined to save the house elves from their miserable situation, yet she had no idea how many people who used house elves would react. As Ron mentioned, his mother had always wanted a house elf, and Mrs. Weasley was undoubtedly a good person. If even she thought this way, one could only imagine the attitude of a wizard like Lucius Malfoy towards liberating house elves. But Professor Blaine promised me that as long as the elves agree, he is willing to give them remuneration and various holidays, Hermione insisted stubbornly. She now realized how easy it was to talk to Professor Blaine. She frowned, folded her arms unconsciously, and tried hard to think of how to convince wizards outside the school, while Dom slipped from her lap. You can't expect everyone to be like Professor Blaine and Professor Dumbledore, Hagrid said sharply. How many people can be as noble as them? And take Professor Blaine's request, for example, Hermione, Hagrid continued seriously. You let the house elves get paid, but what do they do with the reward? No wizard will sell things to house elves. Their hard-earned money is galleons, but when they turn around, they will be targeted by some bad guys. Do you expect the Ministry of Magic to make the decision for them? Impossible, Harry said flatly. During the Quidditch final, the Ministry of Magic didn't even let Remus sit in the best seat. They sent aurors to watch him and others like him. Yes, Hagrid smiled, but none of the three noticed the bitterness in his smile. So understand, Hermione, this is not as simple as you think. Let's talk about holidays. It is also unrealistic. Holidays are not a good thing for house elves. They are born to take care of people. They like this, you know. They would be miserable if they were not allowed to work, and it would be a shame for them to be paid. But I heard that when Harry liberated Dobby, Hermione immediately retorted, Dobby was so happy at that time. Yes, there are some exceptions in every creature. I don't deny that there are a few elves who are willing to be free, but you will never be able to convince most elves to fight for freedom. Really, that's impossible, Hermione. Look at this little guy. Hagrid, who had been serious, suddenly looked at the kitchen with a smile. It's working for me. Hermione immediately cast a shocked look towards the kitchen and found that Dom had sneaked in while she was distracted and was helping Hagrid with his work. The dishwasher was shining brightly, and Dom was now wiping Hagrid's greasy, dark stove. Stop it, Dom, Hermione yelled in anger, which scared Dom so much that he dropped the rag in his hand. As Hermione rushed over, Hagrid raised his head, looked around his hut, and said with a little regret, To be honest, I really need a house elf here to help me clean up. Last time Professor Moody came to express his willingness to patrol the Forbidden Forest for me, he also suggested that I tidy up. Dom would like to help Mistress Granger's friend clean the house? Dom looked at Hermione pitifully and annoyed, as if she had suddenly interrupted his wonderful fun. Hagrid raised his eyebrows and stopped talking, while Hermione, who had obviously realized how difficult the matter was, sat on the bench angrily, folding her arms and saying nothing. To be honest, Harry didn't want to be involved in this troublesome matter, so he shrank back and remained silent. However, a ray of blue light suddenly flashed outside the abyss-dark window, and Harry was stunned, just as he was deep in thought. What you were doing sneaking around the castle at this hour? Professor Moody's voice was gruff, yet there was a hint of curiosity in his tone. Harry, feeling the weight of Moody's magical eye upon him, hesitated for a moment before speaking. We were just, discussing some plans for a new club, Professor, he stammered, trying to sound as convincing as possible. Moody's normal eye narrowed slightly, while his magical eye continued to swivel, taking in every detail. A club, you say? And what sort of club requires the use of an invisibility cloak? Hermione, unable to contain herself, stepped forward. It's a House Elf Rights Promotion Association, Professor. We believe that house elves deserve fair treatment, including pay and vacations. We're trying to gather support and make a real change. Moody's expression softened slightly, though his demeanor remained stern. Ambitious, Miss Granger, but you must be careful. Not everyone will share your enthusiasm for such a cause. Ron, who had been silent until now, muttered under his breath, That's an understatement. Ignoring Ron's comment, Hermione continued, We plan to speak with Professor Blaine about it. He's shown interest in supporting our cause. Moody nodded slowly, his gaze shifting between the three students. Professor Blaine is a good man. If he supports you, then perhaps you're on the right track. But remember, change doesn't come easy, especially in the wizarding world. Harry, Ron, and Hermione exchanged glances, a mix of determination and apprehension in their eyes. They knew the road ahead would be challenging, but Hermione's resolve was unwavering. "Thank you, Professor," Hermione said earnestly. "We'll be careful." Moody grunted in response, his magical eye still fixed on them. "See that you are. Now, off to bed with you, and try to stay out of trouble." With that, the three friends hurried inside, the weight of their mission pressing heavily upon them. As they made their way through the dimly lit corridors of Hogwarts, Hermione's mind was already racing with ideas and plans for their new association. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but with the support of her friends and the guidance of Professor Blaine, she was determined to make a difference. "Why are you wandering around the castle when it's time to go to bed?" Surprisingly, there wasn't much anger in Professor Moody's voice, which gave Harry a glimmer of hope that they might escape punishment. "It's my fault, Professor Moody," Hermione admitted, her face turning red as her usual confidence waned. She lowered her head and continued, "I had a question about the blast-ended scroots that I wanted to ask Hagrid. Harry and Ron were worried I might be in danger, so they insisted on accompanying me." Harry and Ron both frowned, ready to refute Hermione's claim, but she discreetly pinched the soft flesh on their waists, causing them to gasp in pain. "Yes," Professor Moody said, his gaze fixed on Hermione's face with an amused expression. "You also brought a gift for Hagrid, didn't you? Miss Granger, I must admit, you are quite the noble little wizard." End of this chapter. Chapter 5 and 34, a month later. "I must admit, you are a noble little wizard." Professor Moody's deep voice resonated through the dimly lit foyer. Hermione, who was at the forefront, suddenly turned pale. She stared blankly at Moody's intimidating blue magical eye, shivering slightly out of fear. Harry, upon hearing this, widened his eyes in surprise, his heart pounding in his chest. He recalled the flickering blue light that had flashed through the dark window when he was in Hagrid's cabin. Glancing at Moody's magical eye, Harry instinctively exclaimed, "Earlier in Hagrid's hut, you were right outside the window." "Oh, very perceptive, Mr. Potter." "You're quite sharp," Professor Moody replied, his voice tinged with admiration. "When I returned from patrolling the Forbidden Forest, I noticed 3 individuals wearing invisibility cloaks sneaking towards Hagrid's house. As a professor, I had every reason to investigate. What if they were dark wizards with malicious intent?" Harry silently cursed, wondering how Moody could see through the invisibility cloak, yet not identify them. However, he dared not challenge Professor Moody's words. "So, Miss Granger," Professor Moody's blue magical eye focused on Hermione. Somehow, Harry sensed that Professor Moody wasn't truly angry. In fact, he seemed somewhat pleased with their actions. "I must admit, you surprised me," he continued, approaching Hermione with his cane. Despite the minimal height difference, Hermione's lowered head made Professor Moody appear much taller. He looked down at her, his voice carrying a wounded tone, like the whistling of a leaking bellows. "In my long career, I've encountered many with evil intentions. I've personally sent many of these wrongdoers to Azkaban, but I didn't expect to find a young wizard like you." Professor Moody gazed at Hermione with appreciation. "You respect life, Miss Granger. Even if it's just a poor, humble house elf, you strive to help them fight for their rights. I can tell you, among those who claim to be righteous wizards, there aren't many like you. Such kindness." Hermione looked up, disbelief etched on her face. She had anticipated a harsh rebuke from Professor Moody. Recalling what he did when Malfoy attacked Harry, she feared she might face a similar fate. Yet, unexpectedly, Professor Moody praised her, leaving Hermione feeling ashamed. "I shouldn't have lied to you, Professor Moody. I just—" Hermione's voice trembled with tears, but Professor Moody interrupted her gently. "No need to explain, Miss Granger. No one wants to be punished," Moody said, stepping aside and leaving the door ajar for them. "But now, it's really time for you to return to your dormitory. Atticus Blaine sometimes roams the castle at night. I'm not sure if he would be as lenient." "You're letting us go?" Ron asked in disbelief. "You won't deduct points, put us in solitary confinement, or tell Professor McGonagall about our night outing?" "If you want me to, Mr. Weasley," Professor Moody chuckled darkly, "I can certainly oblige." Harry, Ron, and Hermione dashed up the stairs in the hall as if fleeing for their lives. They didn't notice Professor Moody standing in the shadows, watching their retreating figures with a contemplative gaze until they disappeared from view. "I can't believe he let us go," Ron exclaimed in shock as they stepped through the fat lady's portrait into the common room, where only a faint light remained. "And his eye can see through." "The invisibility cloak's disguise," Harry exclaimed, "has only ever been seen by Professor Dumbledore and Professor Blaine. I need to get back to the dormitory quickly and think about how we should promote it before bed," Hermione declared, her eyes alight with inspiration. She hurried towards the girls' dormitory, seemingly unfazed by the recent events. "Are you crazy?" Ron shouted after her. "That elf of yours nearly got us killed by Moody." Hermione, undeterred, bounded up the spiral staircase with determined steps, ignoring Ron's protests. "I think she's just lost it," Ron grumbled to Harry, frustration evident in his voice. "When will she calm down?" Harry merely shrugged, offering no response. Contrary to Ron's expectations, Hermione did not retreat into silence. Instead, she pursued her mission with unwavering dedication. Over the next month, Hogwarts remained relatively uneventful, save for the establishment of SPEW, Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare, by Hermione Granger. Since that fateful night, Hermione, though not visiting Hagrid's hut daily, frequently dragged Harry and Ron along to see Dom, the house elf. They witnessed Dom's remarkable growth, from a creature not much larger than a goblin to nearly as tall as Dobby in just over a month. Despite Hermione's efforts to teach Dom to rest and enjoy life, her attempts were futile. For Dom, work was synonymous with rest and enjoyment. Hagrid's home underwent a transformation with Dom's presence. The once dim and creature-scented cabin became bright and welcoming. Dom spent hours scrubbing the windows and floors until they gleamed, and the century-old stove regained its metallic shine. Hagrid's damp bedding was perpetually clean, and even Fang's black fur shone with health. Dom would sneak out at night to tend to the vegetable garden, weeding, removing pests, and watering the plants. However, Dom's disregard for Hagrid's beloved snails nearly disrupted Hagrid's life and cooking routine. "Just leave it here, Hermione," Hagrid pleaded one day, his beetle-like eyes wide with desperation. "I promised to teach Dom how to enjoy life." Despite his assurances, Hermione took Dom back to the castle, hiding him in a chest of drawers in the common room. Within 2 days, chaos ensued. Without Dom, Hagrid's hut fell into disarray, and Hermione couldn't explain the mysteriously clean and polished common room floor or the neatly folded girls' underwear. Lavender Brown nearly reported the incident to Professor McGonagall, but Hermione managed to dissuade her with some quick thinking. Hermione's efforts with the Elf Rights Promotion Association also faced challenges. During Professor Blaine's physical education class, while everyone practiced dodging, Hermione passionately advocated for the fair treatment of house elves. Predictably, the Slytherins mocked her. "Do you see yourself in those little ones, Granger?" Pansy Parkinson taunted loudly, yet Hermione remained undeterred, collecting membership fees with a piggy bank and fervently trying to recruit Ernie into the association. It wasn't that no one joined. Some people, like Ginny, Luna, and Hannah, were indeed willing to listen to Hermione's persistent encouragement and even paid the 2 Silver Sickles membership dues. Cho Chang also joined, having been personally invited by Harry. However, Harry couldn't shake the feeling that Cho's initial stunned expression suggested she might have joined simply to avoid embarrassment. Additionally, Professor Atticus Blaine made a significant contribution. He generously donated 10 gold galleons and didn't object to Hermione's activities during his class. This alone convinced Harry that Hagrid's praise was entirely justified. Professor Blaine was indeed an extraordinary wizard, not just in terms of power. On a Wednesday night in late October, during Professor Blaine's physical education class, something unexpected happened once again. End of this chapter. Chapter 535. The Situation. In late October, the chill of the first night temperatures was already palpable. A cold breeze swept across the Black Lake, carrying with it a fog that enveloped the grounds of Hogsmeade and the Hogwarts campus. The tall, imposing castle stood shrouded in mist, giving it a desolate appearance at first glance. Yet, inside the physical education classroom, the atmosphere was anything but bleak. The young wizards had shed their robes, tossing them aside as they rolled up their sleeves and used their wands to ignite fires on their armor. Over the past month, these students had transformed significantly since the start of the school year. Their demeanor was more assured, their eyes shone with focus, and they exuded a newfound confidence and calmness. Atticus Blaine walked among the young wizards, hands clasped behind his back. As he observed their faces, a sense of pride welled up within him. The students were diligently practicing dueling spells, but this time not within Atticus's spiritual realm. Having mastered some practical spells, Atticus encouraged them to practice in the real world, as there were subtle differences between casting spells in a spiritual space and in reality. It was crucial for them to become adept in a more realistic setting. Suddenly, a bright red light, as thick as a thumb, zipped past Atticus, slicing through the air with a sharp whistle. The red light struck the armor 30 feet away with the precision of an arrow, causing the spear it held to clatter to the ground and spin back towards the spellcaster. This was not the end. The armor, now hit by the spell, was enveloped in tiny red lightning bolts. Amidst the strange crackling sounds, the armor creaked and shrank. This was Harry's handiwork, a paralyzing disarming spell, executed silently. Nearby, Hermione was practicing her own spells. Her attacks were a testament to her strengths. Unlike Harry, who excelled in disarming spells, Hermione's movements were nimble, employing a variety of spells for her attacks. However, due to the limited training time, she struggled to cast every spell silently, occasionally uttering incantations aloud. Hiss, hiss! Several black pythons, as thick as forearms, sprang from the tip of Draco's wand, landing on the ground. They stood upright, hissing and flicking their scarlet tongues at the armor. A cold gleam shone in the python's eyes. Draco lowered his wand, and the pythons slithered swiftly and unpredictably across the ground. Within moments, they surrounded the armor, coiling around it tightly. Creak, creak. The sound was unnerving as the hard armor deformed under the pressure of Draco's conjured serpents. Where the armor's shoulders were pierced by the python's fangs, a foul black smoke rose, and the bronze armor quickly turned white and began to decay. Witnessing this, Draco grinned with excitement. He instinctively sought out Harry, but upon meeting Professor Blaine's gaze, he quickly withdrew and focused on the self-repairing armor. Atticus paused in his observations. He noticed Ginny summoning a swarm of bats, startling Finch Fletchley nearby. Luna, the whimsical witch, waved her wand with a graceful flourish, as if dancing. From her wand emerged colorful, note-like objects that effortlessly shredded her armor to pieces. Cedric Diggory, Theodore Knott, and Blaise Zabini were all practicing in their unique styles. Atticus turned his attention to the scene before him, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. Neville Longbottom, who was secluded in a remote location practicing magic, furrowed his brows unconsciously. Despite his remarkable physical talent and quick thinking in emergencies, Neville's awkwardness with spellcasting was painfully evident. While he wasn't necessarily bad at reciting spells or waving his wand, his control over magic was severely lacking. Even the new magic training method developed by Atticus Blaine couldn't assist him. Unlike Harry, who relied on instinct and talent to amplify his disarming spell, or Hermione, who mastered a variety of spells through exceptional concentration and control, Neville struggled. To this day, he frequently failed at casting basic attack spells, which eroded the confidence he had painstakingly built in this course. Truth be told, Longbottom's predicament was a source of frustration for Atticus Blaine. If this continued, Neville would likely falter, but Blaine was determined not to abandon the young wizard he had been committed to training. He was resolute in finding a way to help Neville discover his path to improvement. Blaine's brow furrowed deeper as he pondered this challenge. Suddenly, the sharp sound of clapping echoed through the sweltering training room. Upon receiving the signal, the young wizards ceased their practice and gathered around Professor Blaine, who stood at the front of the classroom, now magically expanded to the size of a Quidditch pitch. They arranged themselves according to their house training, displaying impressive discipline. Each student gazed at the stoic-faced Professor Blaine with admiration, particularly the Slytherins, whose eyes shone with fervor. Due to Professor Blaine's rules, no one dared to flaunt their progress or engage in conflicts, but they were acutely aware of the transformations brought about by over a month of training. Today's training concludes here, Professor Blaine announced with a smile. Hermione wiped the sweat from her brow, her eyes darting restlessly as she searched for today's public relations target in the crowd, while Harry discreetly distanced himself from her. Before you leave, I have some news to share. The school planned to announce this on Friday, but I believe students in physical education classes deserve a little privilege. The young wizards puffed out their chests with pride, their eyes fixed on Professor Blaine. At the start of this semester, during the sorting ceremony, I mentioned that the Triwizard Tournament would be held this year. The other two schools, Durmstrang and Beauxbatons, will arrive at Hogwarts next Friday. In the coming days of this school year, the brave candidates from these schools will live and study alongside you. Professor Blaine's words were like a drop of cold water hitting boiling oil, igniting the classroom's atmosphere. Being a group of young wizards who relished excitement, they couldn't contain their enthusiasm and began animated discussions with their peers. Professor Blaine, Cedric from Hufflepuff eagerly raised his hand. But the school hasn't announced the regulations for selecting champions yet. When our guests arrive, I will announce it in the Great Hall. For now, it's still confidential, Professor Blaine replied, smiling at the disappointed faces of the students. What about the competition events, Professor Blaine? Fred Weasley called out loudly. The school still plans to prohibit underage students from participating, right? I'm afraid so, Professor Blaine confirmed with a smile. As for the events, Professor Blaine spread his hands innocently. I don't know. The competition events are determined by the Department of International Magical Cooperation and the Department of Magical Games and Sports. To ensure fairness, they keep the details strictly confidential and do not disclose them to the 3 participating schools in advance. A chorus of disappointed sighs echoed through the classroom. All right, Professor Blaine clapped his hands to regain their attention. I'm sharing this news to prepare those interested in competing as champions. Although I shouldn't show favoritism, I do hope that the student representing Hogwarts will come from among you. If not, I will be disappointed. Just as Professor Blaine was expressing his hopes, a loud crash came from outside the curtained window. The students instinctively turned to look and saw an owl flapping its wings frantically, eager to enter. Typically, owls delivering letters would appear collectively in the Great Hall during breakfast, so a delivery at this hour was unusual. Atticus Blaine raised an eyebrow slightly. He walked over, opened the window, and retrieved a parchment from the beak of the damp, feathered brown owl. After gently patting the owl's head, he read the unrolled parchment by the light of a wall torch. Silence filled the room. What happened? Harry whispered to Hermione, noticing the sudden seriousness in Professor Blaine's expression. Has anything been mentioned in the Daily Prophet recently? Hermione hesitated for a moment before shaking her head slightly. No, Harry. Professor Blaine's demeanor returned to normal as he addressed the class. This Friday's physical education class will be supervised by Hermione Granger, Neville Longbottom, and Luna Lovegood, he announced calmly. I have an urgent matter to attend to and must leave Hogwarts for a few days. With that, Professor Blaine strode out of the classroom, leaving the bewildered students exchanging puzzled glances. End of this chapter. Chapter 536, Lurking. After leaving a group of unsuspecting young wizards in the physical education classroom, Atticus Blaine's demeanor shifted to one of calm determination. A flicker of lightning danced in his lavender eyes as he strode purposefully through the castle corridors, heading towards the tower where Dumbledore's office was located. As he entered the corridor connecting the smaller towers, Atticus paused abruptly, instinctively stepping back. Just then, a brilliant burst of fire erupted in the dim air before him. As the flames subsided, Dumbledore and Fawkes appeared, their expressions grave. Atticus, Dumbledore began, stepping out from the still dissipating embers. His collar, beneath his long, silver-white beard, was slightly askew, evidence of his hurried change of clothes after receiving urgent news. Have you been informed? He asked solemnly. Atticus nodded slightly. Sirius sent me a letter outlining the situation. He mentioned that Kingsley also informed you. Remus has been taken to the Ministry by Scrimgeour and is currently detained by the Auror office, Dumbledore explained. Scrimgeour found a pretext to hold Remus and Delis, likely to prevent any illegal actions against him. Normally, Remus's case should be reported to Amelia, but this was ordered personally by Connolly. I suspect Scrimgeour will inform Cornelius Fudge. We must devise a proper response before the situation escalates. The world outside was cloaked in darkness as Dumbledore and Atticus, illuminated by Fawkes's light, exchanged their thoughts rapidly. Dumbledore was focused, a look Atticus hadn't seen in some time. I'm afraid Remus might end up in Azkaban, Dumbledore continued. Remus acted on my instructions, and I won't let him suffer the same fate as Sirius, Atticus replied calmly. That's why I'm here. I want to handle this. Cornelius Fudge must recognize my influence. He won't think that simply sending Sirius to the Auror's office repaid the favor from the night of the Quidditch final. If we intervene together, it will pressure Fudge and strip him of his last support. A minister of magic who has lost his composure will only create more problems for us. You have a good understanding of Connolly, Atticus, Dumbledore admitted, surprised by Atticus's request for him to remain uninvolved. After a moment of contemplation, he acknowledged the logic in Atticus's proposal. With a hint of caution, he asked, Are you sure you can handle this appropriately, Atticus? Dumbledore emphasized the word appropriately, concerned not only about rescuing Remus, but also ensuring the Ministry of Magic remained intact. Rest assured, Atticus nodded confidently, neither Remus nor the Ministry of Magic will face any harm. I'll lend you Fawkes, Atticus, Dumbledore offered, despite his reservations about Atticus's assurance. In this matter, it was indeed more fitting for Atticus to take the lead. Dumbledore finally agreed to the plan, glancing at Fawkes hovering above. The key now is to buy time. Fawkes can assist you. Thank you, Atticus replied. Wait for my news. With that, he and Fawkes vanished into a burst of flames, leaving Dumbledore alone in the wind-swept corridor, frowning as he gazed at the encroaching darkness outside the castle. Meanwhile, in London, Diagon Alley buzzed with activity, its nighttime vibrancy rivaling that of the day. While most locals avoid this area after dark, foreign wizards visiting for sightseeing and tourism fill the void. The entrances to Ollivander's, the Jumping Magic Joke goods store, and the Ela Owl Shop remain bustling with visitors. Additionally, the station in Diagon Alley is teeming with activity. The train from Skyline has just arrived, and as the cargo boxes are opened, workers who have been waiting eagerly rush forward. They swiftly unload boxes of raw materials for crafting magical goods from the train and load them onto the carriages designated for transport. On either side of the railway, stern-faced wizards stand at regular intervals. With wands in hand, their sharp eyes continuously scan the crowded platform, vigilant for any suspicious individuals. These raw materials are crucial for the production of various magical items. Not only are they expensive, but their ingredients are also kept strictly confidential due to commercial secrecy. The supervising wizards, identifiable by the unique emblems embroidered on their robes, hail from different families. Under their watchful eyes, the workers operate with remarkable efficiency. In just over an hour, all the raw materials are loaded onto the carriages. A special freight channel is opened, and sturdy horses, their breaths visible in the cool air, pull the goods off the platform in an orderly procession. As the workers await the next train, the overseeing wizards quickly find their places atop the carriages, ready to escort the goods to the factory. Amidst the organized chaos of unloading, everyone's focus is on the departing goods. Unnoticed, a shadow slips quietly beneath the train chassis, moving stealthily under the moonlight obscured by dark clouds, and enters the territory of a carriage. Diagon Alley is not merely a wizarding commercial street, it is a vast and intricate complex. It houses businesses, residences, black markets, and factories. The convoy of carriages leaving the train station takes to the main road. After traveling for a while, they diverge and disappear into various narrow alleys under the cover of night, still half a mile from the bustling downtown area. The sound of wooden wheels rolling over the stone road is stiff and mechanical. Coupled with the rickety frames and the dark night, even the most alert guards begin to feel drowsy. Yet the shadow lurking in the carriage area remains ever vigilant. The carriages navigate the maze-like alleys, finally slowing down after about an hour. From above, one would never imagine such a spacious factory area nestled among the dense buildings of Diagon Alley. In fact, these factories are not uncommon, but they are protected by powerful magic, making them indistinguishable to the unknowing eye. The convoy halts at a factory with no sign outside, only a towering iron gate reminiscent of the entrance to Hogwarts. The carriages come to a stop, and the overseers and wizards atop each carriage dismount in unison, standing silently beside their respective vehicles. A foreman-like figure exchanges a few words with a group of wizards waiting at the gate, reporting on the escort process. Although the journey was uneventful, the gatekeepers remain vigilant. They begin inspecting each carriage, starting from the front, ensuring everything is in order. The inspection was conducted with meticulous care. Inspectors opened the carriage, which had been magically expanded to accommodate more space, to ensure no one was hiding inside. They also thoroughly examined the underside of the carriage. A wizard assigned to guard the factory approached the carriage where the hidden individual was concealed. He conducted his search as usual, and after finding nothing suspicious, he crouched down, squinting to scrutinize the carriage's chassis. His keen eyes missed no detail, yet the uneven chassis appeared perfectly normal. Satisfied, the wizard allowed the carriage to proceed, moving on to the next one. As he straightened up, he let out a heavy breath, barely audible amidst the ambient noise. With the inspection complete, the convoy, which had been stationary for quite some time, resumed its journey with the creaking of the opening doors. The convoy entered the factory grounds, passing through an empty area that housed only a single factory building and a newly constructed office. Nearby, a group of workers stood ready to unload the goods. The hidden individual, Atticus Blaine, knew it was time to make his move. As the carriage passed through a thicket, he seized the opportunity when a dark cloud obscured the moonlight. At that moment, the escorting wizard, anticipating the journey's end, relaxed his vigilance. Atticus slipped into the bushes unnoticed. The once quiet factory area buzzed with active, punctuated by shouts and the issuing of orders. Atticus withdrew his gaze from the bustling scene and turned his attention to the office building, where a few lights remained on. Just then, the thick clouds parted, allowing the bright moonlight to illuminate the building. The large, dark gold nameplate reading, Flu Pow, shimmered in the moonlight. End of this chapter. Chapter 37, Idle Chapter and Bad Luck. Under the serene glow of the moonlight, the office building gradually dimmed as lights flickered off one by one. Wizards, weary from a long day's work, descended to the first floor, forming a line in front of the lobby's fireplace. This was a strictly enclosed factory area, where no companions were permitted beyond the gate. The factory was bound by the anti-apparition and no-fly spells, leaving the fireplace as the sole means of exit for the staff. As the office fell silent, the factory across the road continued to hum with activity. Atticus Blaine stood on the rooftop's edge, gazing at the windowless factory building, the wind tousling his hair. A trace of concern lingered in his eyes. "For you," a voice called from behind. Atticus, unfazed, turned to see his colleague offering him a sandwich. He unwrapped it and took a hearty bite, mumbling through a mouthful, "Oh, that's delicious. Thank you, Tonks." "You're welcome," Tonks replied, clearly pleased with the compliment. Her hair shifted from chestnut to violet as she leaned against the railing, her gaze fixed on the factory. "It's just a waste of time," she murmured softly. Atticus smiled wryly at her complaint, though he shared her sentiment. Half a month ago, several prominent companies in the wizarding world had been targeted by thieves. These intruders, despite breaching the company's heavily guarded core offices, took nothing. Instead, they meticulously searched the executive offices, leaving no trace of their presence. However, astute business operators detected subtle clues through surveillance magic. Pressured by these companies, the Ministry of Magic was urged to apprehend the culprits. Under mounting pressure, Cornelius Fudge mobilized the ministry's elite forces. Some were tasked with tracking down leads, while others were deployed to prevent further incidents. Consequently, Atticus and Tonks found themselves stationed here. The Flu Powder Company, a monopoly in the wizarding world, was founded by Ignata Westsmith in the 13th century. As the sole authorized producer of flu powder, it played a crucial role in the daily travel of countless wizarding families, making its security paramount. While Atticus and Tonks kept watch on the roof, Kingsley and Dellis waited in an office below. Yet, as Tonks pointed out, the limited manpower of the Auror office made it impossible to fully protect all significant companies. "Have you heard?" Tonks asked, her tone casual despite the task at hand. "Next week, the people from Durmstrang and Beauxbatons are coming to Hogwarts." Her eyes sparkled with envy. Why couldn't the Department of International Magical Cooperation and the Department of Magical Sports do something useful when I was at Hogwarts? "I wonder if Mr. Scrimgeour would let me take 2 days off during the Triwizard Tournament?" "You're dreaming, Tonks," Atticus replied with a rueful smile. "Since I became an Auror, the Ministry hasn't granted me a single day off. I've been hoping to visit Hogwarts to see Harry." "Oh, the boy who lived, Harry Potter!" Tonks exclaimed, her voice tinged with admiration. Suddenly intrigued, she asked with enthusiasm, "Do you think he will participate in the Triwizard Tournament?" "Impossible," Sirius replied with a smile. "I know Harry well. He wouldn't shy away from the dangers of the Triwizard Tournament, but the issue is his age. With Atticus Blaine at Hogwarts, even if Harry and his friends wanted to find a loophole, they wouldn't stand a chance. Speaking of which, Tonks, you and Atticus attended Hogwarts together, didn't you?" "We were even in detention together," Tonks said with a nostalgic smile. "He's 2 years older than me. When he first arrived at Hogwarts, he was quite different from how he is now. He wasn't very social, but you could tell from his eyes that he wasn't afraid to engage with others. He always carried baskets of books with him, earning him the reputation of a famous nerd." "Sounds a bit like Harry's friend, Hermione Granger," Sirius remarked with a slight smile. "When I was at Hogwarts, Lily was the one who loved learning the most. You know, she was Harry's mother. The smartest witch I've ever known, admired by many. James, of course, was always trying to get her attention, often causing trouble just to be near her. As for Peter, let's not discuss him. Remus, on the other hand, greatly admired Lily's intelligence. He was the hardest working among us." "Remus told me how you all became friends," Tonks said, her energy renewed. "He mentioned that you were one of the few who didn't care about his condition." "He actually told you that?" Sirius looked at Tonks in surprise. "Remus doesn't usually share his past easily. I bet, Tonks, Remus must like you a lot." Though she knew Sirius didn't mean like in a romantic sense, Tonks was still pleased, her hair turning a vibrant pink. She eagerly asked Sirius to share more stories from their past. Sirius, a legend in the Ministry of Magic, had a life story that intrigued many. He didn't find Tonks's request unusual, especially since Atticus had encouraged him to make more friends within the Ministry. Apart from a few secrets, he was open about his past. To ensure Dellis and Kingsley below didn't realize they were slacking off, Sirius cast a spell to prevent eavesdropping. He then continued to chat with Tonks about the past. Engrossed in their conversation, they lost track of time. Tonks shared her memories of Atticus Blaine from their school days, while Sirius recounted the adventures he and his friends had at Hogwarts. As time passed, the moonlight grew brighter against the deep night sky. They watched a large group of horse-drawn carriages parked outside the factory for inspection, then observed as the convoy moved into the factory's unloading channel. Sirius turned his attention back to their conversation. "After I graduated, I had a falling out with my family and moved in with James. His family treated me like a second son. James and I tried to persuade Remus to join us, but he was always worried about losing control and harming James' family. As the war intensified, boom. The ground beneath them suddenly shook as if a volcano had erupted. A massive fireball burst through the wall, shooting into the air. A figure in a black cloak Kingsley was hurled into the corridor by the force of the explosion, his arm bleeding profusely. With his free hand, he raised his wand and blasted a hole in the ceiling, shouting, "Tonks, Sirius, what are you doing?" Dellis had already emerged from the swirling smoke, his expression fierce and determined as he charged toward the black-cloaked wizard who lay unconscious on the ground. Under the bright moonlight, the shattered mask revealed the wizard's face, leaving Sirius and Tonks on the rooftop momentarily stunned. End of this chapter. Chapter 5 and 38. Trustworthy London, a world-renowned international metropolis, is a vibrant hub in Muggle society. At 10 o'clock at night, the city is just waking up to its nightlife. The bustling commercial streets are teeming with people, filling every inch of space. Bathed in brilliant neon lights, they wander in and out of shops, bars, and cafes, reveling in the advancements that Muggle technology has brought to their lives. A few blocks away, a sudden burst of fireworks illuminated a dilapidated building. In a quiet village or the wilderness, such a display would be striking, but in a city awash with neon lights, it went largely unnoticed. Even the two lovers, lost in each other in the shadowy gap of the building's side wall, failed to notice the commotion on the nearby rooftop. Atticus Blaine emerged from the flames, surveying his surroundings. Spotting the solitary red phone booth standing in the cold wind on the desolate street below, he sighed in relief and affectionately patted the warm head of Fawkes, his phoenix companion. Long-distance disembodiment is taxing for wizards. Although Atticus could manage it without crossing borders, it still took a toll on his abilities. In contrast, Fawkes's method of space traversal posed no such risks. Dumbledore's choice of pet was indeed practical, especially since most wizard space-sealing spells were ineffective against Fawkes. Time was of the essence, and Atticus couldn't afford any delays. He drew his wand and etched silvery white marks into the night-blurred space. A ground snake with black and white wings emerged from the marks, slithering before Atticus. After infusing it with a few wisps of silvery mist, the snake spread its wings and dove toward the earth like a streak of light, disappearing into the ground without a trace. With his task complete, Atticus pocketed his wand. He stood on the rooftop, gazing at the Muggle shopping street, as bright as day. His eyes pierced through the walls, observing the laughter and joy below, and he fell into a long silence. Fawkes tilted his head, his jewel-like eyes reflecting the faint loneliness on Atticus's young face. Accustomed to this expression, Fawkes chirped melodiously and gently nuzzled Atticus's cool cheek. Suddenly, an explosion shattered the night's tranquility, and Sirius appeared on the deserted street below. To Atticus's surprise, Tonks was with him. "I'm here." Atticus's voice, though normal, reached Sirius and Tonks with precision. In two rapid blasts, they apparated to the rooftop. "Atticus!" Sirius, looking thinner than he had a month ago, rushed to him. His skin had regained the pallor it had when they last went to sea. After a quick glance at Fawkes perched on Atticus's shoulder, Sirius calmed himself and spoke urgently. "What are you doing here? Why didn't you come directly to the Ministry? We need to hurry. Scrimgeour has already gone to Fudge to report the situation. If they act before we do, then Remus." Sirius was panting, fear flickering in his gray eyes. No one understood the horrors of Azkaban better than he did. If Remus were detained there, it would be disastrous. "First, tell me the situation in detail," Atticus replied calmly. "How did Remus end up in your custody? Was it a coincidence, or—" "It was a complete surprise," Sirius began, his voice tinged with the weight of past experiences. Amidst the tumult of winds and waves, Atticus Blaine quickly composed himself. After a brief pause to gather his thoughts, he spoke swiftly. "Recently, several prominent companies have experienced infiltration incidents. Fortunately, nothing has been lost. Normally, such matters would be handled by the regular enforcement team or the strikers of the enforcement department. However, these companies have been pressuring Fudge to expedite the investigation. Consequently, Fudge instructed Scrimgeour to deploy us. One team is tracking the culprits, while another is on guard duty. Tonight, Tonks, Kingsley, and Dellis were dispatched via the Flu network. I was on guard duty and didn't expect this." Sirius's face was clouded with concern. He hadn't anticipated encountering Remus under such circumstances. "I don't know," Tonks exclaimed, bewildered. "Could Remus be involved in the previous incidents? Why would he do this? He certainly wasn't stealing, right? The companies that approached the Ministry of Magic have already stated that nothing was taken. So, is he investigating something?" Atticus glanced at Sirius, who appeared calm. It was clear that Remus was acting on Atticus's orders, investigating the true controlling families behind these giant corporations. These individuals were notoriously elusive, adept at concealing their identities. "We'll discuss this later." Atticus gestured for Tonks to remain calm, then turned to Sirius. "How is Remus doing now?" He's detained in a cell at the Auror's office. He had a scuffle with Dellis and Kingsley. When he was brought to the Ministry of Magic, he was still unconscious, Sirius replied, a hint of malice in his eyes. I checked his injuries. They're not serious, just some bruises. Scrimgeour won't let me near the cell. My relationship with Remus isn't a secret, and he's probably worried I'll help Remus escape. Dellis has always been hostile towards me and is keeping a close watch. Dellis has always believed that you were the dark wizard who unleashed the fierce fire during the mission at Grimmauld Place last year, Tonks said, looking at Atticus nervously. You're sure you can get Remus out, right, Atticus? Rest assured, Atticus smiled reassuringly. Remus will be fine, but right now, we need time. Time? Sirius's brow furrowed. What do you need us to do, Atticus? You mentioned that Remus was unconscious when he was brought to the Ministry of Magic, correct? Atticus asked. After Sirius confirmed, Atticus nodded slightly. You need to seize the opportunity to send a message to Remus, advising him to remain in a state of unclear consciousness. I suggest you enlist Kingsley's help. He has a good relationship with Dumbledore and won't refuse your request. I suspect Dumbledore has already instructed him to assist. Atticus paused, ensuring he had their full attention, then continued. According to the law, even a suspect has the right to request medical treatment from the Ministry of Magic before cooperating with an investigation. You can help Remus apply to go to St. Mungo's for treatment first. Regardless, I need him to buy me 2 to 3 days. You're not going to show up now? Sirius was taken aback. I need to make some preparations, Atticus explained, signaling his readiness. If I confront the Ministry of Magic now, it would be akin to using force to compel them to release Remus. Although Fudge might eventually relent, it's not a wise approach. I have a better strategy to handle this situation. As the brilliant fire dissipated before him, Sirius exhaled heavily and turned to Tonks. Let's head back to the Ministry. I can't get close to the cell. You need to find a reason to call Kingsley and ask him to help deliver Atticus Blaine's message to Remus, Tonks said, her voice tinged with concern. Do you really think Atticus can save Remus? I know he's incredibly powerful, but he can't just act recklessly, can he? Dumbledore wouldn't approve of such actions. A brief silence followed as Sirius gazed at the spot where Atticus had vanished. Don't worry, he reassured her. Atticus is a reliable person. I have faith that he will be able to rescue Remus. End of this chapter. Chapter 539, Visiting the Goblin. In the early morning, the sun began to rise, casting its golden rays over Paris and dispelling the fog that had rolled in from the Seine River, enveloping much of the city. Paris, a city of dreams, was just awakening from its slumber. The wide streets were not yet bustling with the usual traffic, and only a few early risers could be seen jogging or cycling along the sidewalks. Gringotts World Bank, the stronghold of goblins and the financial epicenter of the wizarding world, stood tall and imposing. The industrious goblins, driven by their insatiable desire for wealth, had no concept of rest. The lights in the towering building had been aglow throughout the night, and even as dawn broke, the glow from the windows was only slightly dimmed by the rising sun. Inside, the goblins, their eyes red from fatigue, continued to work tirelessly at their desks. As with any society, there existed a privileged class among the goblins. The higher floors of the building were notably quieter, serving as both the workplace and residence for the goblins of high status. Here, the affluent goblins indulged in sumptuous breakfasts, savoring the peaceful morning hours. At the very top of Gringotts World Bank resided Mr. Gerson Barna, the venerable leader of the powerful goblin clan. Mr. Barna, advanced in years, reserved the hours from 3 to 8 in the morning for himself, ensuring he had ample energy for the day's demands. This private time was sacrosanct, and no one dared to disturb him. However, today was an exception. A group of goblins, dressed in elegant black attire, hurried up from the lower floors, carrying trays of exquisite pastries. After a thorough inspection, they were permitted entry into Mr. Barna's office, a room filled with fireplaces connected to branches worldwide. In the center of this vast room stood a table that had never been there before. Its legs were intricately carved with artistic patterns, and it was draped with a tablecloth woven from unicorn hair. The table was adorned with decorative bonsai, candlesticks, and the finest tableware, all meticulously arranged. Two goblins, Jingay and Lottie, directed the waitstaff in setting the pastries on the table with precision. Mr. Barna had given explicit instructions to prepare for an exceptionally distinguished guest, and they were determined to present the most impeccable service. "What is happening?" Lady, now more composed after a previous incident, asked Jingay, who had relayed the orders. Despite the calm demeanor, curiosity got the better of Lottie. "This hasn't happened in the past 20 years. Who is Mr. Barna entertaining?" "I don't know," Jingay replied, casting a cautionary glance at Lottie. "Besides, it's not our concern, lady. We just need to follow the instructions." Lottie's lips quivered, clearly dissatisfied with Jingay's response, but ultimately chose to remain silent, returning to the armrest of the chair reserved for Mr. Barna. At that moment, one of the many fireplaces lining the office walls suddenly came to life. The runes above it glowed, and a green flame burst forth from the previously dormant hearth. Both Lottie and Jingay turned their attention to the unexpected arrival. The wrinkles on their foreheads deepened as they frowned, expecting the guest to enter through the office door. To their surprise, Mr. Barna had entrusted this guest with the use of the fireplace in the room. As the green flame subsided, revealing the figure stepping out, an overwhelming panic surged through Lottie and Jingay, nearly drowning their reason. "Ah, it's you two little fellows," Atticus Blaine remarked, brushing the ashes from his robe. He glanced around the office he had visited a few months prior. The spacious room's furnishings remained largely unchanged, save for a dining table now positioned beneath the stunning crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling. Atticus also noticed two elves standing by the armrests of the chairs flanking the table, visibly startled by his presence. Atticus couldn't forget that during his last visit to Paris for an inquiry meeting about the Triwizard Tournament, these two goblins had kidnapped him from the Goblin Hotel. "Jingo and Lottie," he said, approaching the dining table with a smile. "I hope I remembered your names correctly. You seem to be recovering well?" That night, he had clashed with Jingay, who had a broken arm, and a group of guard goblins in this very office. The two goblins had been seriously injured, and under normal circumstances, they might not have survived or could have been left disabled. However, judging by their upright stance, they seemed to have recovered well. "They should be grateful for your restraint, Mr. Blaine," a voice interjected as a secret door at the other end of the room opened. Mr. Barna, clad in a silver-green robe with a gray beard streaked with dark green, entered the office. Adjusting the reading glasses perched on his nose, he confirmed that the visitor was indeed Atticus Blaine. His steps grew more vigorous as he approached Atticus. "Welcome, Mr. Blaine," the old goblin greeted, extending a somewhat withered hand. Atticus bent down with a smile, shaking Mr. Barna's hand warmly. "I hope my unexpected visit hasn't caused you any trouble, Mr. Barna." Lady and Jingo pulled out soft chairs for Atticus and Barna to sit. Their hands trembled, not from fear of Mr. Barna, but from Atticus Blaine. Goblins were known for being well-informed, and Atticus Blaine's legendary duel at the Quidditch World Cup Finals had surely reached their ears, even if it traveled by snail mail. After learning the details of the battle through their unique channels, all the goblins involved in the kidnapping incident that night, who were still alive, broke into a cold sweat. They realized that without Mr. Barna's wisdom, the goblins of Gringotts World Bank might have met their end that night. Atticus noticed the cold sweat on Jingay's forehead. He smiled slightly, but his supposedly gentle smile caused the one-armed goblin to tremble violently, his dark green skin turning pale. Atticus shifted his focus to the exquisite pastries on the dining table and the steaming green tea in the delicate teacup. "It seems you've learned my preferences quite well," Atticus said cheerfully. "You lived in Paris for several months, Mr. Blaine." The shrewd old goblin replied in a raspy voice. "So, it wasn't difficult to inquire about your personal habits. We are also quite adept at understanding wizards' ways. Hospitality etiquette dictates that as a distinguished guest, you are deserving of our utmost efforts. I hope you won't find us negligent in any way." "Ha, certainly not," Atticus Blaine replied, lifting the teacup to his lips and savoring the unique bitterness. He observed the old goblin seated across the dining table, noting the vigilance and curiosity in his eyes. Atticus smiled gently and remarked, "Ah, this is truly delightful." He gestured to the green leaves floating in the delicate teacup. I must admit, Mr. Bana, I've never tasted such fragrant and sweet tea. I almost regret not accepting your invitation to collaborate earlier. Perhaps I could have enjoyed this sooner. Atticus referred to a letter Mr. Bana had sent him previously, proposing to advertise during the Triwizard Tournament. Atticus had declined, not only because he wished to preserve the integrity of the event at Hogwarts, but also because he sensed that Gerson Bana, who managed Gringotts World Bank, had ulterior motives. The offer seemed more like a veiled attempt to curry favor with gold. "It is an honor to be appreciated by you," the old goblin replied smoothly. "Of course, it is truly my regret that we couldn't reach an agreement." Atticus set down his teacup and interlaced his fingers on the table's edge. He gazed at the seasoned Gerson Bana, whose eyes, though seemingly dim, sparkled with a hidden light. With a slight smile, Atticus said, "The purpose of my visit is precisely to address those regrets." Chapter 540, Cooperating with Goblins. "I came here just to make up for my regrets," Atticus Blaine said in a casual tone, breaking the brief silence that had settled in the room. Mr. Barna, seated across from Atticus, regarded him with a calm demeanor, his skin creased like aged bark. "What a pleasant surprise, Mr. Blaine," Mr. Barna replied slowly, though he felt no surprise at all. How could a wizard like Atticus Blaine reverse a decision he had already made? He squinted slightly, feigning just the right amount of joy. "I must thank you for your tolerance, Mr. Blaine. Rest assured, you need not worry about remuneration. In this matter, the goblins will not charge any fees. All advertising revenue will belong to Hogwarts." "Please don't misunderstand, Mr. Barna," Atticus replied with a soft smile. "I still don't intend to allow those mixed workshops or companies to advertise during the Triwizard Tournament hosted by Hogwarts. This isn't the Quidditch World Cup. The commercial atmosphere would be too overwhelming and inappropriate." Under Barna's focused gaze, Atticus retrieved something from his pocket and handed it to Jinge, the little elf who had been waiting nervously by his side. Stunned for a moment, Jinge quickly regained composure, took the item with one hand, and hurried to the other side of the dining table. "This is—" Mr. Barna examined the object Atticus had handed over, adjusting his reading glasses. "This is what was mentioned in the security report you submitted to the competition review team at the Wizards' Council. The surveillance mirror is a fascinating invention and quite practical. The goblins have conducted internal evaluations. If this could be mass-produced, it would open up a huge market." Barna's voice grew more intrigued. "Yes, it is indeed widely applicable," Atticus acknowledged, "but for certain reasons, I personally don't want it to be used extensively in the daily life of wizards. Mr. Barna, now that you understand the surveillance mirror, have you considered using it to broadcast the Triwizard Tournament live?" The old goblin was genuinely taken aback. He hadn't expected Atticus Blaine to propose such an idea. However, the prospect of broadcasting the Triwizard Tournament live across Europe in all countries with Gringotts quickly replaced the dullness in Gerson Barna's eyes with a spark of excitement. "Can you ensure the broadcast is timely?" Barna asked, sitting up straighter, his tone filled with surprise. "With some adjustments," Atticus nodded slightly. "You can collaborate with WWN, Wizard Wireless Network, and pay to use the signal receiving stations they've established across Europe. By making some modifications to the surveillance mirrors, it will work. Although the Triwizard Tournament is primarily a competition for young wizards, it holds significant historical importance in European magical history. I believe many will be interested." Interest was just the beginning. Even the two little goblins, Jinge and Ladi, realized the immense wealth potential hidden within this venture. The revenue from ticket sales was just the tip of the iceberg. The advertisements at various venues and the galleons from goblin-organized gambling were unimaginable. When Atticus Blaine initially refused to cooperate in the production of surveillance mirrors, Mr. Barna felt a twinge of disappointment. But now, the excitement coursing through his old veins was undeniable. "This is indeed a very lucrative opportunity, Mr. Blaine." The old goblin's hoarse voice brimmed with excitement. "With this brilliant idea, you could become one of the wealthiest wizards. Mr. Blaine, if we can introduce this method to the Quidditch League, then—" Atticus Blaine raised an eyebrow, slightly taken aback. This goblin's business acumen was indeed impressive. He had only just begun, yet he was already introducing innovative ideas. It was a concept that could continuously generate wealth, but there were still many hurdles to overcome before it could become a stable source of income. As he observed the old Blaine, who was lost in thoughts about the industry's future, Atticus tapped his fingers on the table. "You have a very keen business sense, Mr. Barna, but we can discuss these long-term matters later. For now, our focus should be on the broadcast of the Triwizard Tournament." "Ah, please forgive my rudeness, Mr. Blaine," the old goblin said, snapping out of his reverie and bowing his head slightly. "It's been a long time since I've encountered such a brilliant idea. Of course, we are currently discussing the live broadcast of the Triwizard Tournament. We must quickly reach an agreement with WWN and secure venues and newspapers across European countries for publicity. This venture will bring us substantial profits, you see. The goblins need to pay me a percentage of the profits," Atticus interjected with a smile, surprising the goblin. "This percentage will be given to the warriors participating in the Triwizard Tournament as a token of appreciation for their contribution to the European magical community." In other words, Atticus Blaine was not planning to interfere with the remaining profits, leaving them entirely to the goblins. This seemed impossible. Gerson Barna quickly assessed the situation. Throughout his long career, he had encountered many traps set by cunning wizards. These traps were always enticing, but if one was blinded by greed, the losses could be unbearable. Goblins always pursued the greatest interests, but this did not mean they were easily swayed by the allure of gold. In fact, their desire for wealth made them more ambitious than most wizards. "Thank you for your generosity, Mr. Blaine," Gerson Barna replied, his voice regaining its cautious tone. "But I believe that you, having contributed this wonderful idea, and Hogwarts should be handsomely rewarded, shouldn't you?" "Don't misunderstand, Mr. Barna," Atticus maintained his graceful smile. "Neither Hogwarts nor I will take a single gold coin from the live event's proceeds, but that doesn't mean we have no other requests." As the old goblin listened intently, Atticus continued calmly. "On the surface, goblins focus on Gringotts' banking business, but in reality, they are involved in many industries privately. Besides investments, you control various alchemy workshops in different countries. What I need is an alchemy workshop in the UK with complete production capabilities." The old goblin's eyelids twitched slightly. "An alchemy workshop with complete production functions, Mr. Blaine," Mr. Barna said with a hint of displeasure. "You must understand its value." "I understand perfectly," Atticus replied calmly. "But I believe the income from the Triwizard Tournament live broadcast should be sufficient to cover the purchase of the alchemy workshop, correct? In fact, I could use my share of the income to buy it, but I lack the time and energy to handle this matter, so I've chosen this convenient method." Barna quickly calculated in his mind and then fell silent. To be fair, the transaction wasn't a loss, but he felt uneasy because he didn't fully understand Atticus Blaine's eagerness to acquire the alchemy workshop. While deep in thought, his eyes suddenly caught the surveillance mirror on the table in front of him. The old goblin's eyes lit up. He blurted out, "Are you planning to build an alchemy workshop to mass-produce surveillance mirrors, Mr. Blaine?" Barna felt he had uncovered the truth of the matter. The potential applications of alchemical tools like surveillance mirrors were vast. As the inventor, Atticus Blaine would have easily secured the production license, allowing him to exclusively benefit from this creation. In the long run, he could also profit from its use in the Quidditch League. No wonder he had found excuses to refuse collaboration on the surveillance mirror. "Oh, I've already mentioned it, Mr. Barna." Just as the old goblin was convinced he had discovered the truth, Atticus shook his head slightly and replied with a smile. "I don't intend to widely introduce this invention into the daily lives of wizards. I need the alchemy workshop for other projects that require mass production." End of this chapter.